What's going on, everyone? It is David Palmer, Leo King, and Dr. Ann Wohlcke here for History in the Stars. Super excited to be here and super happy to have everyone here. How you doing, Ann?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing great. It's been awesome to just be in these times, and at the same time, it's been a lot going on.
Mhm.
Lots of things to discuss, of course, lots of ideas running through my mind, lots of history I've been going through, lots of astrology. Oh, geez, like lots of weird Mercury retrograde stuff that comes out of nowhere. Um, it's been great, but
Yeah.
it's had its challenges too. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I had a really busy last week and did a lot of driving and traveling. You had a really busy last week.
Hmm.
I forgot to even ask you before our show about how your jet ski race went. You're only doing jet ski racing, moving an entire studio. Yeah, just little things going on.
Yeah, I'm doing the best that I can, and it went good. I took a third on Saturday, and I had to retune my jet ski to go all the way to crazy tune, meaning I had to retune the computer to go to insane mode and put it up to the highest RPM I could go.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, but then I pulled off a first. So I'm still number one in points. I have one more race for the Western National Championship in a month and then World
Wow.
Finals. So
Wow. Well, congratulations.
thank you.
I mean, I think it's such a great example too of the things we're going to talk about today, like crazy times or the times when people are uncertain about what's happening and um when history makes these big pivots and big changes happen, we think about them being sort of these crisis moments, but you're carrying on, we're all carrying on doing our things. You're managing all these really big things like extreme sports, moving a business,
Right.
and life goes on, right? People are sort of designed to continue to move forward. And I think people, first of all, need to always remember that that's what we do. People survive. We're
Yes.
programmed to do it. And it takes a lot to convince us that we can't survive. And I think we need to remember that too, right?
Right. And I think that's what I think led us to do this version of the show, which is a little bit more, over a longer period of history and maybe not so directed specifically at a point with the astrology, but the astrology would be that the culmination of all these transits are at a massive turning point in the world where it almost does feel like you live in two different lives because the world doesn't look the same anymore. And to reflect on those in history, it's like how did past civilizations, past societies, past governments, past, all of our ancestors, how did they deal with these times? And where are those things, especially since you are an amazing historian and professor of history, that I feel like it would be great to go back and forth and find some of those moments that can help people really not be so afraid that this is also part of history, these kind of moments that we've been in, because they're not just like one event. It's the cause of multiple events and multiple, layers of time. And we're kind of in the middle of so many layers that it's almost hard to remember that, um, or be surprised that things are changing so much because it's been so much all at once, it feels. Is that a good
Mhm.
way to put it?
Yeah, I think it's so much all at once. And besides the fact that there's so much all at once, I think we are constantly bombarded with the idea that there's so much all at once. And then we're constantly being told that we're being told what we should fear, that there's not only is there so much happening, but there's something we need to fear. And this has been going on for how many years now since it's been just all the time, right? Since COVID times, it just,
Yeah, and
always
that's what's
something.
interesting. We've covered it a lot, but that Saturn
Mhm.
Pluto conjunction in Capricorn with Jupiter there, that brings us to back to 1518. That brings us back to 1284. And it's like looking at those periods, it's this great fear, and there's also a loss of control that happens. And I think the way that societies have been set up in history, and even if you reflect on today's world, the loss of that subconscious feeling that life is certain, and that's a form of control in yourself, right? Like, I know for sure the grocery store works and I can drive to this place. These are things that make you feel comfortable, but also that, it's not like a massive earthquake to the whole system is going to take it away, but it's like watching slowly, like in the 1280s, watching the holy wars and these crusades that had been going on for these, hundreds of years prior, that dissipate to where there's just nothing but actual loss, and getting to a place to where that's not a normal thing anymore, and there's a different world. Like, the Christians are not going to be in control of the Holy Land, and and that's a really hard thing for people to take at the Vatican at the time, or even just in society in the Western world, or 15, 17 into 18, this idea that the way that the religion's being taught and the way that the Pope is acting like the supreme leader more than his role as Pope, for the church, gets Martin Luther to really crack the system and wake a lot of people up, especially now that they can start to finally read the Bible and so forth for the first time in their life, or have one for themselves, and read it not in Latin. These are the things that at those times are way more intense, but uh, to us, those don't seem that intense because we're in a world now where we have so much technology, we have more information, but it is just as extreme. We just might not be seeing it fully yet because we
Mhm.
get thrown the fear stuff a lot of, like, if this person's in power, if that happens, if this happens, then what do you do? And because maybe the system's stronger than it's ever been in history, because if you think about our structures of our civilization today, it's very much, people back in the old days weren't walking around with a driver's license like on some piece of like wood that they carved their name on to get through the next door and to get to do this and to do that. I mean, it was a lot simpler. So I think
Hmm.
that it
It
makes
is
it more
interesting,
extreme that it's not so simple.
right? Of course, I always have to come back with something about a point that you'll make. And I'll say that, one reason people didn't need a driver's license or an ID back then is that people didn't travel like they do now. And so if you were an outsider in a community, you just stuck out and people knew you didn't belong.
Mm,
Now, it's almost like, well, you brought up the issue of control, and I think that's a huge part of what we're experiencing now and what's always happened in these kind of crisis moments in history. There are moments when there's a regime change or some kind of a paradigm shift where whatever is the powerful structure, whatever are the ways of doing things fall apart, and then the new ways are emerging at the same time. And there's always a conflict. Whereas most people, it wouldn't even bother you, right? Like if the Holy Land, for example, like you mentioned in history, right? The
hmm
Crusades end, and or a crusade ends, and there's the loss of the Holy Land, the worst thing that Christians had been fearing, because and right, and nobody would have known if the church hadn't been telling everybody, hey, we need your money, because if we don't have your money, we can't go fight the Muslims in the Holy Land, and the center of Christianity is going to fall, and Jerusalem will be in Muslim hands, and we need your money, or we need your support, we need the men, we need all this stuff. And so it was the people who wanted to actually secure the Holy Land who had to figure out how to make everybody else buy into the same narrative, make everyone afraid so that they could propagate it, right?
Right.
But if you think about those times, nobody traveled, right? You had to be a knight or you had to be somebody with money who could be in that very narrow elite class, but everybody in society was made to pray for them or made to think about it all the time so that they kept their attention focused on it. And I feel like that's one thing I'm noticing now in these times where the old is slipping away, the way that we're made to, like the way that our attention's focused on something that somebody else wants, like the side that wants to win wants us on this, like wants us to believe these things. Um, it's like I just never expected or imagined how much people will just sit back and say, okay, that's what we're believing now and carry on. So sorry, I
Well, and
said
I
a
think
lot. I'm
that
not sure if it
that
made
no, no, I think you bring up a good point because I think that kind of reminds me of the the Saturn Pluto conjunctions that happen in Capricorn with happens with Jupiter happening to be there too, is that people start questioning more, but at the same time there is that loss of control feeling that you want to actually gain more control. So, you know, the heresy of Martin, Luther, right, is like, oh my gosh, how did he dare say that about our Pope? Right? Like
Mm,
it's not just the church, right? Like sure there's a movement for Martin Luther, but even Henry VIII, who eventually does the biggest and leaves the church, he even put out his papers, and we've covered that, right? And saying like he didn't agree with what Martin Luther did. But then if you were to talk to him afterwards, when Pluto finally ingresses into Aquarius, it's like he would have been high-fiving the guy probably. And he did get excommunicated. So it is interesting that to me, I look at this moment in history where it's good to question. And some people might look at it as beliefs, but then there's another side where maybe it's just the constant questioning and it's not adding up. So it's not a belief, it's more of the facts aren't lining up. So I have questions still. So that means I'm not joining the belief or I'm not joining this, collective or social direction. I think that's kind of the interesting spot because it's like I think the belief thing's being thrown around is like everybody's following some sort of belief system. But I think right now there's more of a belief system off just like I just want to keep things going the way it is and I don't want anything that threatens that subconscious control element that's in within oneself. Ironically, though, it's usually people being controlled that are the ones that don't realize that and that control is to have them become the pawns and the rooks and the knights that support that king or queen on the chessboard.
mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting how power dynamics, the players change, but the power
Yeah.
dynamics stay so similar throughout history. And, first of all, I always wonder to myself, what are we supposed to be learning? And are we ever, people, like if you look at the past, I feel like it's so important because you see how these patterns work. And it's almost like, okay, these things might automatically always happen. It might just be the nature of living on Earth that and I guess the astrology and the astronomy shows that, right? It just shows that's there are these cycles and these things build up and then they break down. Um,
Yes.
but I do feel that history is really important to look at because as the patterns are happening, we see the ways in which people survive and build something out of it, right? That it's not ever one-sided, no matter how much control we're being told or we fear is out there that other people control. out of it, that they're controlling us. No matter how much we fear that, we always still have our power. And that's why I teach history, because I love to find those moments of where people are empowered. And, I've always loved to teach that way. This is the first time that I've ever thought to myself, I wonder if I continue to teach these stories in the same way, am I not going to be allowed to?
Mm.
It's really weird that to feel that you can't teach people that ordinary folks have power. So that's just different. But
Well, and
um
I think that's what makes taking the history. This is the first time that we've had a 248-year that we know, I guess, in history. Maybe you would know better, that's had people rule their own selves for so long and to allow freedom of speech, um,
mm,
to where nobody can stop that, right? Especially the government or the people that are in charge of the government or any leader to actually tell you not to speak.
right.
The fact that that's in question or that that's being normalized as how dare you speak the way that you're speaking, um, that's a really weird position because that's a new space because you can't really go back in history and go, yeah, 350 million. And if you were to break that down to, let's say, 500 years ago, it'd probably be like, I don't know, a country of 20 million or 15 million, maybe, right? Where not everybody's had the ability to do that and express themselves and have the freedom to do that. So that's kind of the anomaly of this moment is watching, because the control, I think, is the big part that people look at control as kind of like the aggressive person who, or the CEO who micromanages, or but it's more of this. I'll throw in the Neptune Pisces transit that we're at because it's finishing, and that's of course more related to 1860 and to 61, and even going back to the Salem witch trials, right? In those times, it's more of like getting the hysteria built up over an idea that could be completely more in favor for the control. um like the Salem witch trials, for example. I mean, families turned against each other, communities turned against each other in that
Mhm.
time period so fast,
Yeah.
um because they didn't understand what they were seeing, in another, and so that's kind of a common theme that you're mixing in. And I think what's really hard about these times and this turning point is you're getting big major turning points in astrology individually that are on themselves, the ones that you as a historian cover and teach as a professor at a university. But we're getting multiple of them at the same time. So it feels like it's maybe too much for people. And I think that's where society has a moment here to really reflect on, you know, what is it going to do? Because it's not so much of like who's going to do it that's in a place of authority, but it's much more the people of the world that have to make those changes instead of just wait for the person who's going to do it. Because I
Mhm.
think that's kind of the problem that shows up in history is every turning point happens, and the astrology, like Pluto, for example, when it comes into a new sign, it always looks like there's some great, huge person that's going to change the day. And people really buy it really fast.
Mhm.
And whether you see that in American elections like 2008, um, it's hard because those Pluto ingress moments, can be at times sometimes when there isn't an election or something. So it could be in other ways too, like a way of thinking or a way of life or some sort of thing that everybody gets swayed into, easy. But that one's happening again. It just so happened to be the 16-year transit, 2008 to 2024, of this Pluto ingressing into a new sign that, you see the person who you don't know too much about come up and everybody just falls in love really fast. I think it's interesting too that it becomes kind of like that person's horrible and this person's a saint.
Right.
And so you mix that with the Neptune crisis, I'll call it, at the end of its own home sign in Pisces, which brings up religion, or it brings up fantasy, or it brings up media now, and especially anything that's more visual, like television, or things that are dealing with these color and sound waves and so forth, which is our television or our phones, and how just people can just see something and not question it, just be like, well, that's what it says, so that's what I'm going to go by. The box on my phone, the black screen says this, so that's what I'm going to do.
Hmm. Yeah.
Where in history do you find that most people, like when and you specialize in English history,
Hmm.
but I know you do so much of it. You teach other parts of history too, world history and so forth. But is it always to where it takes just a small group of people or an individual to kind of go the other way to kind of get people to start thinking differently? Because the fact that we have this access where anybody can speak, anybody can make a YouTube, anybody can, become a voice that could be heard so fast and actually make something of it. Yet there seems to be a lot of fear even now. So that's a kind of common denominator of this, like, fear of actually putting yourself out there fully and saying how you really feel. And there might be repercussions, but you know, what I've noticed is people are afraid of those repercussions more than they are the real thing to say. Is
Hmm.
that something that's pretty common that you see?
Um, I think so. I do think that that happens in so many contexts that I can think of. And I think, okay, so let's take the example of the Salem witch trials, that we think about that as, so I could tell the story of, okay, the minister of the congregation was a new minister and wanted some special perks that he felt he was owed because he was this new young minister. And so one way to do that was to scare people into doing what he wanted, right? Because he wanted the firewood, he wanted all these things, and people were that society had started to fall apart already, and people were not really all about just one church. So in order to bring them all back together again, he got people to fear each other and to fear witches. And he did this over time. That's the thing, that people always think it's going to be a boogeyman coming in and taking over and implementing something new, and doing the Stalin lockdown thing. But as someone in the chat on High Vibe pointed out, Chris H said the UK has arrested more people for things they said online than Russia by a lot, right? So that's the thing, that these things happen in little increments, and it's over time that people slowly are taught a new way of thinking, so that, out eventually, so in Salem, you had this minister who every Sunday could give a sermon and tell people about what to fear. And very slowly, it was like, wait a second, I just saw that woman doing that thing. And so that can happen. And then by the time you get to the point where you're accusing people, um, or pointing fingers, people willingly believe because they've already been taught, behind the scenes, subconsciously, whatever it is, what is the enemy. And so there's almost
Mm,
no, the way that that kind of thing happens is there's hardly any voices of dissent, right? There's not, people aren't saying, wait a second, let me question that fact. Because on top of that, you had the people punished publicly, and you don't want to fall victim to that. So it's just really insidious, is the only word, to just see how that kind of thing can play out. So that, um, you can point out something at this point on any side of the political spectrum, for example. Now, I feel like you could hold up a document and say, look at this proof, like, or have the video. Well, the video footage could be faked, right? You could have the fingerprints, you could have all kinds of stuff and say, look at this. This is what somebody did. And the other side will say, well, that was fact checked. Nope, that's not true. And it's just like, how do you get to the point where people won't look at what's reality because the other reality that they're trying to deny seems worse? And I mean, that's the thing that I can see in different times in history as well, when people had to be taught to police themselves, like a bunch of, like, sorry, I'm going on and on, David, but one more thing is, like, I work on the 18th century in London, and this was a time when they wanted to regulate fairs out of the city because it was seen as being too disrupted. And every summer there were these festivals happening all over the place. And one way that they did that, because it didn't work to just go in and shut it down because there weren't enough people to do it, for one thing. So just over time, they just, new people kind of moved in. They had new ideas about what was proper behavior in public. And then they got more and more people to buy into this new idea about what was polite, that those people started to police themselves and then started policing their neighbors. And pretty soon, the developers could come in and build all these new shops or build these new homes, and the people are making money because you got the inconvenient people out of the way. And I feel like that's kind of the, you know, that's something that happens a lot in history.
I love that you bring those things up because it's very relatable to now, I feel. The way that, a sermon can be said every Sunday is kind of like the Sunday political shows, right? You find your side that you want to listen to. So there's a little bit more you know, you get your side, but that could also feed it. Um, Another part too is I think of, like, if you were to think of, like, if you were to go to Italy and you were to go to the Vatican and you were to go see all the beautiful paintings done, right? Like, if you were to go anywhere else, in the Renaissance period, it's not like the whole part of Europe was going through a Renaissance where every town you went into was the greatest painter, or you could go see the most greatest mural of um, angelic paintings, or paintings that are, reflections of Christ or in the Bible or any of these more beautiful art. It was a flourishing thing, but it was more in these more main hubs, right? That and that's really what we're in. We're in the same astrology as like another Renaissance. It's just on a wider scale, but it's more of the wider scale of the eyes that are seeing it. It's still a very small amount of people actually contributing to it. So the problem with that to me is, like, with right now, is you have a lot of eyeballs. There was a lot of eyeballs back then, but only so many people actually doing it. And so that kind of steers people to be a certain way. If you were to make an image, let's say, of, you know, like Archangel Michael, I love some of those images, and him as he's protecting heaven, as he puts his foot on Lucifer's face and brings all the fallen angels back down to purgatory and hell, let's say, right? That back then, that has a significance of, like, a visual look at things, and that there also is something following and protecting us with God that's going to do that. But today it's visual by the way that it's like kind of like clips of what people say and then twisting them, or commentary is kind of this new art style. Podcasts. I feel like podcasts, though, have dramatically been more leaning on the questioning side, more than let's just follow the narrative, although I'm sure there's a lot of those. But that would kind of make me feel like more people that were close to, whether the church or close to a monarch, who maybe were lords in a town and had, maybe more ways of their own privy council that they got to deal with the king and get orders to be a certain way and to kind of lay the law of the land for the king or the queen at the times, that people are still kind of following these people who are connected to somebody, and the orders are kind of brought down and they're kind of the ones that speak it, and if it ever gets really crazy, then they'll try and bring in the big people or the people that surround that big person. And it's one of those things to where I look at like this world at this moment going, I've never seen them really mess with the painting so much, right? Whether it's like imagery we see on TV. I know a lot of people are upset about the Olympics and the opening ceremony. And, it's like there's a lot of this similarity going on that actually is also in history, like kind of defaming, you know, spiritual art per se. That actually does happen, and it definitely happened in the Holy Wars too. Um, but I think that we're at this weird moment here where it's all become too fast and too instant that people can't see, what's happening, because it's funny. It can be right in your face, and there's 15 questions you can ask about it, whether it's a video you're watching or a speech or anything. And there's a lot of weirder things happening, but the echo chamber is so loud. If you say something that's different, you could, if nowadays, if you were to walk up to Washington and be Martin Luther and put your thesis together and put it on the wall, you'd probably be arrested before you made it even to the wall or the doors.
Right.
So,
Um,
and we're seeing that in all protests on all sides. It doesn't matter if it's a left or a right wing thing, like whether it's pro Palestine people or pro Israel, and then if you get on to other sides, if it's about a left wing cause or a right wing cause, like I think that people need to start seeing that it's more in common what people are going through, and how to break some of these glass ceilings. I feel are being willing to say things that might not be in the more establishment. And that's, I think, what we see in history during these big transits that we're in, is like this establishment puts on a better show than they really are really going through internally, or what's behind closed doors.
mhm. Yeah, I really liked how I think it is deep astrology this week. You talked about the idea of Beatlemania,
Yeah.
and I really think that was the best. Well, after people got over being offended about some people, right? About
I didn't
maybe
know
Yellow
people were
Submarine
offended, but
wasn't the best song ever done, right?
oh, my joke was, because you just want to go to bed listening to Yellow Submarine.
I don't.
I know, but it's like, I thought that
But
was a good way to kind of put Beatlemania in these moments right
right.
now.
But I feel like that was such a good example because that's what is this is the idea of mania, or inculcating in people this desire for one thing only, right? And the screaming fans in Beatlemania, like you see in Hard Day's Night, the pictures of all the girls screaming in the front row and even some boys, right? Everybody was so wrapped up in it. And you can still hear stories today of people talking about how they felt in those concerts. And it's kind of like I started to think about that because one of the things that I've heard from people because I think I've said this before that my son loves the Beatles and we listen to the Beatles channel a lot when he's in the car.
Hmm.
So I thought that was a good example. But people will call up and talk about their experiences. And sometimes people will say, okay, it was 1964. I don't know when their invasion was, the British invasion, right? But it was right after the Kennedy assassination, and so many people will talk about how it was what they needed. It was like the light that they needed. And they got so wrapped up in it because everybody had been so depressed with the Kennedy assassination. So
Mm.
this past week I was in Dallas, and we went past the assassination site and took a look at the book depository and everything. And I know you've done that with Craig also. But because I
Yeah,
had just,
we spent about 10 hours there, very much
wow,
in investigative mode.
yeah, I would have
Even
loved
though it was
to,
hot in Dallas, but yeah.
yeah, talk about, I don't know how people survive the heat out there, but yeah, I just would have liked to spend so much more time there looking at it. And I loved seeing people there investigating and really like examining the site. You know, I love when historic sites are being frequented by people, even though it is such a horrible thing that happened there. But I thought I was there after I had listened to Deep Astrology. So as I was looking at it, I thought, huh, how interesting. And we've talked about this on History in the Stars when we looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Mm,
that you have to wonder, was the media really kind of trying to divert attention then, or was somebody wanting them to divert attention at that point?
right.
While after the assassination, as horrible as that was, and I didn't live through that, I don't know what that was like. And I know it really shaped a lot of people. And it's something people still remember as such a traumatic event to this day. So, but meanwhile, if you think about what was happening in the government with the changeover in government, that was a time when people were really focused on, first of all, kind of the funeral and just trying to come to
Right.
terms with the grief. Then you've got Beatlemania right after that. People were so directed towards something else that meanwhile we're ramping up our involvement in Vietnam, and all kinds of stuff is going on behind the scenes. So then by the time the Beatles turn around and join that movement where they start to protest war and all of that, then they're the bad guys. And all those people were taken out who had been allowed to kind of have a voice and critique things for a while. And that's kind of what I was thinking about. And for some reason that came up while you were talking about what happens. It's like something will come up where attention is focused on and riveted on one thing. And I'm so surprised that even today that can happen, because we have so many things we could choose from. Why do so many people care about politics right now? Why are
Well,
we so focused on it?
astrologically, that's because Pluto will come back into Capricorn in what I think it's today's the 14th, so we're at about 15 days away.
Mm,
Um, that 16 years of a transit of Pluto, which Pluto has different transit times, so it's not like Pluto's every 16 years through a zodiac sign. It's going to be 20 in Aquarius, and then it keeps adding up. We're going to where Pluto really slows down in orbit or has a longer orbit on, let's say, a 180-degree angle view of a transit heliocentrically around the sun, that it's slower through the tropical zodiac. It's slower through our view, although it's kind of crazier because we don't see Pluto. It's fallen in declination so much to where it goes into the underworld, technically, that you don't see it. But that's what's because it's been in Capricorn the last 16 years have been this build up about it being about government. 2020, of course, was all the planets to make that stellium, which is three or more planets all in the same place, very close. And so it becomes all about the restructuring and also the secrets and the secret deals and the weird things that come from government. And unfortunately, the history shows that, people stand up against it, and then there's the standing back against it from the government side or the leadership side. And then there's a lot of people that follow that leadership that's in question because they don't want to lose control, or they don't want to, it kind of ruins their lives and their dreams as far as what they maybe wanted to achieve or where they wanted to go with life, because it was connected to that kind of, opportunity in that kind of a world that had those things, right? Like, for example, you're seeing social media right now going through a massive shift, right? Especially about children, right? So, you know, for you to just go like try and make a YouTube or an Instagram for, let's say, your 5-year-old to go be some big pop star is not going to really work. So if you want that, well, you would vote in these days for continuing with that allowance, right? And so like those are the things people aren't seeing in this whole government role, is what are these actual things that are really affecting people's lives that have detriments to them, and that actually at the same time have a hidden control over you that you don't know. Like taxes are a great example. Pluto is the planet that does rule taxes. Like, in life, there's just death and taxes are just something that are all part of our lives, and even with death comes taxes, right? You're taxed even when you die, and somebody else has to deal with it. That's very Pluto. It always deals with somebody else. It always deals with some outer entity. It always deals with something that wants something from you, even when you're dead, right? Because even somebody else might still want to love on you as a family member, a friend, or a past lover, right? When you're dead. So Pluto deals with how does that affect us in our lives through these government aspects. And Pluto is also a place where we get tired of things and sick of things. Disgusted, to be honest, is another good point. It's Scorpio that is ruled by Pluto, right? So we can get over things. So people are over the government thing. Yet
Mm-hmm.
that's where the people who understand these transits take advantage, because they know people are like, you know what, I'm over it. I'm not paying attention anymore. And Pluto is saying, like, okay, I guess they're an easy pick. I guess that person's easy. I guess that person's easy because Capricorn's about responsibility. That, we live in the first time where your vote truly, the idea, at least 248 years ago, that did form into a constitution a little bit later, about a decade later, was um, that, yeah, you actually, as a citizen, have the ability to be part of the government and be a leader in the government. And that there is no higher form of that, only the citizens. So the pool is that. Of course, people could talk about, well, you have to have the right bloodline, or you have to know the right people, and all these kind of things. But it's the same concept, that you don't have to be of a royal bloodline from this one family that's on display, and their family puts all their paintings over 1,000 years plus, and this is the way it's got to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that you get a special treatment, and nobody else gets to ever be in that total place of power, only if you're from this family line. So, and I know people can say that about US presidents or whatever, but okay, 10th cousins, like, you don't even know each other, right? Like, it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where it's different, is people right now, the government thing's extreme and they are sick of it. Or now the people who are sick of it are kind of like, oh, I found my happiness through it, or this is a fresh breath of hope again, or something. When really it's like none of the issues over the last 4.5, 4 years, it's going to be almost four, and it's 4.5 now, since 2020, where the peak of this transit's been, have been addressed.
Hmm. Yeah, that there are so many things to talk about from that, but the issue of bloodlines, for example, we were talking about that beforehand because you recently did your genealogy. You've been continuing to put your genealogy together, and you recently found out that you're directly descended from King Edward IV. which I was so impressed by, but also you're a cousin, I think, of Henry VIII, right? Which of course you
Yes.
would be if you're connected to Edward the Fourth.
Yeah, first
Mhm.
cousin ninth removed or something. Like,
Yeah, but I mean, would you be able to tell people how you're connected to Edward the Fourth? Because I think it ties into what you're talking about here.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because my great great grandfather married a Taft, a cousin of President Taft. And so that line through my great great grandmother on my dad's side, just so happens to be very, in the way that lines work, connected all the way up to one of the children that Edward the Fourth had. It was a bastard child and was the daughter, but she was very loved and it was documented, and it was part of the discussions also with the Catholic Church at the time, right? And his father at the time. So like she's my, I forgot, 14th great grandmother, something like that.
Hmm.
So that's how I'm connected, is through that.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting that you're not connected through the legitimate line. And,
Correct.
you know,
Well, yeah, legitimate meaning that it's been stamped by the approval of the king.
mhm. Yeah, and we know, especially from our past shows, that kings and queens always have mistresses and, whatever, mostly it's mistresses with the kings. And there are always these illegitimate kids. And, that's one of the reasons that Henry VIII knew, okay, I can have a boy because I've got this illegitimate boy over here. What's wrong with these women? And he had to keep cycling through his wives. But that's the thing, that there are always there's always qualifications on, or loopholes, I guess, into why do certain people get to have power. And I think that with the last Pluto in Capricorn, and the United States founding, that the founding fathers thought, okay, we finally found a way through this thing that it tends to happen. People look for a magical ruler that can help solve all their problems. And, if we divest or get rid of this idea of royalty, we'll be able to create this new government that is just governed by the people and for the people and all that.
Mm,
Of course, if they don't start to adhere to some sort of religion or political ideology that becomes like a religion, if that starts to happen, then it gets in the way of this idea that certain people are the ones fit to rule. And I
right.
feel like even in the case of kings, where it was supposedly so clear cut, your ancestor actually proves it. So first of all, the fact that you're descended from the line that's not the direct, official line, it shows that, okay, well, there were certain children that were pushed aside or had to be given these titles or other ways to
Right.
provide because they weren't the ones that were going to be in line for the royal position. So there's always qualifications, right? Then Henry VIII was the main one who came in and upset it, but actually even before that, right? Because Edward the Fourth is a Yorkist king, and Richard the Third takes over from him in a way that it's Edward the Fourth's son. I hope I'm correct on all of this, who's the one that is the prince that becomes king, and Richard the Third has to be regent, or argues he needs to be regent for this young prince. And that's how Richard the Third is able to seize power through apparently legal means, working behind the scenes, and he eventually becomes king. And then um, and then he's eventually overthrown by the Lancastrian king, which becomes like the official monarchy at that point. But so it just shows that there's always these dynastic struggles, and it's never clear who is the rightful monarch. And what's
Right.
interesting is how the narrative can be switched, right? Whether it's a religious reason that excludes certain monarchs, or like, or whether it's just like the family bloodline is different, or it could be that somebody wins a battle and that makes him the one who actually gets to be king. There's so many ways to claim legitimacy, and the people who don't really fit the narrative at any one time are the ones that get excluded. But they can't rise, they can't come forward and claim it, because that's the danger. There's always these other people who are connected in some way, and you have to, if you're in power, you need to exclude them first, because they're the ones that can actually overthrow you by name. But it's just
Right.
really interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating because I feel like astrologically these times with Pluto and Aquarius, even though the founding fathers and all the people part of the Continental Army and the the independent movement for America, um, they were all connected to British lines. So in many ways they went against their family, right? Like Benjamin Franklin's own son, right? That was not a fun situation. He stayed part of the British monarchy and took command. I think he was I forgot if he was like a part of like a governor of a territory or something like that, right? He
Yeah.
stayed, or I think he was part of he was high up, and he
Mhm.
stayed a loyalist, and Benjamin Franklin was on the other side.
Right.
And so it's like these are common themes. So like one thing is I know that people right now are struggling with, well, my family doesn't see things the way I do. You're seeing it. It's really been weird for me to see the flip. The last 3 years has been like, I can't believe people aren't seeing through the COVID thing, or I can't believe people aren't seeing through this like weird presidential, weird, all these weird things. Now you're seeing people be like, I can't believe people are, you know, now it's the opposite. Like you're part of disinformation, and that's the thing that's coming out all the time now, right? It's been a repeated theme. Is that's the answer back to any questions? Is it's disinformation or misinformation? And the same thing happened in the last Pluto transit in America, where if you spoke bad about the monarch, that was treasonous,
Hmm.
right? Like where is your loyalty to king and country, sir,
Right.
and your loyalty, it was actually your loyalty too as well. It was like you had to prove that you were loyal to the king by saying it to an officer or saying it to somebody that was high ranking, and they would repeat it, right? So I think it's interesting at this moment where it's like, where's your loyalty? You're seeing it on both sides, because it was on both sides, but there's this like idea of freedom, or this idea of don't question anything here and just call it disinformation or misinformation, right? Like you don't question the king and what any of the orders that the king has done,
Hmm.
right? And even in the UK at the moment right now, the censorship there over the stuff that's happening in the streets there and what's happening with the citizens and the immigration is really extreme. And it's funny because I've been saying for years that I don't think the Pluto return for America is as big, or this Pluto transit as big for America as it is for people under the monarch of the United Kingdom and that monarchy, because America already went through that moment of separation.
Hmm.
So, not to say that I'm predicting that'll happen over there, but it does start looking like that. Like that's Boston Massacre stuff. That's minorly Boston Tea Party in a different way, but rejection of what's happening. And also, it's ironic that there's a new prime minister over there.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of already shows you the difference right away, how things
Right.
are being handled or what's really happening. And then in America, you have rifts, but that's what's really interesting is we're all connected, whether that's spiritually, but technically we're all family, humanity wise, that, we might not all come from the same lines, but that's what's kind of interesting right now is there's a really weird separatism because of Neptune at the end of Pisces, but because also Pluto at the end of Capricorn coming back into Aquarius to stay there. And even Uranus, I mean, Uranus to me is more about kind of like how these countries get along, um, and change alliances and so forth. So all of that's happening at the same time. And I think that people have to remember it's happened before. It's just time went slower, things were slowed down. I think we have to remember to kind of slow our roll, that the things we think are going to happen right away take a little bit more time, whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. Um, I think it only hits you when you're not kind of paying attention and it finally happens. And I think that there's a psychological element to all this because that's really what the astrology shows with the outer planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto is psychological or subconscious or repression, that people are subconsciously not wanting to be hit with the lightning strike of what could shift their known world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's never been higher than this moment of what's going to happen are those shocks, but that it's not like it's going to be the end of you. Um, it's more of the way that you view your subconscious understandings. And that's what's, I think, difficult is when you have a very good system in place for a long time, the subconscious runs smoother. But when there isn't a subconscious smooth moment, like the gears shifting and the clutch is out, like right now, and it's grinding, it wakes you up into a very uncomfortable place. And I think that people have to remember that to be easy on themselves at this moment and be willing to be open-minded, because I think that we don't know everything that's really happening. I'll use one example like today, and this isn't about me picking sides either. It's just because it's a kind of a good example. In 2020, it was like, no, Hunter Biden, there is no laptop. These 50 plus people in the intelligence community say there is no laptop. It's said in the debate, it's said on the media. And then a year and a half goes by and no, there's a laptop, but doesn't look like it's that bad. But then the pictures are going around everywhere, right? And then, of course, yeah, no, there's a laptop. Now, today, Hunter Biden, because after Biden dropped out of the race, somehow, some way, and the media is all reporting on this today, the documents that prove that when Joe Biden was the vice president under Barack Obama, that the Burisma documents are true, that Hunter Biden reached out to U.S. officials in the State Department looking for help while he was on the board for Burisma. And that's been something that's been talked about for even prior to 2020, right? And they said no, would never happen. But ironically, they finally did it after Biden dropped out of the race. And now it's official. And now it's all over the place today. So the media told you that there was no evidence of that. They're lying to you, that he's not on these boards taking favors and money. Just it's all over the media today.
Hmm.
That that like, the big question this week has been the crowds of Kamala Harris. And it's not so much about that there's nobody there, but why is it so AI-ish, right? Like it's more like what like and that's okay to ask that as a question. If it's wrong, then it's wrong. Whatever, right? That'd be kind of like just saying like, why is everybody wearing a red hat? Like, you know what I mean? Like it's just what it's a question.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because of some political movement putting it out there. It's something that has been a recurring theme with Princess Kate Middleton and Associated Press calling that out about the picture with her own kids, right? And her disappearing. And then, of course, waiting to say the excuse was they used that for her cancer diagnosis, not wanting to get out. What's going to be the excuse for these kind of things? And when is the AP going to say that some of these images aren't true? The reason why is because they're not allowing the AP to take the pictures at these events. These are all only coming from the campaign. So even the stream is controlled from the campaign. So it's not like ABC or NBC or CNN or any of these big media companies are there with their own cameras. They're getting the feed the same way that they only got the feed for the inauguration.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so interesting how we talked about this before we went on that, remember when Obama was the president, the Twitter president, who was always in touch with the people. He wasn't afraid of the people. And everybody
Right.
liked that. Oh, yeah, he gets out there and uses social media. And why is it that in just this short time from him to now, the person who's running for president isn't in touch, is not out there just speaking freely with people? And then if you question that, you're a heretic, right? I mean,
Right.
this is the thing. The thing is just that even if you happen to look at a picture and you think, wow, that guy's neck looks really long, what's going on there? Like, did they fill in people in the crowd? Even if you comment on something that is obvious and true, there's another belief out there that the higher important thing is, no, the most important thing is that we all stay on the same page over here. So don't do anything that disrupts this. Our group has to stay together. I mean, what in the world is that? It really reminds me as a historian of what happened under the Inquisition when the higher important value was, according to the Vatican and according to the judges in the different inquisitions, the most important thing was everybody has to stay on the same page in terms of religion. If you even ask a question, you could make people doubt the narrative. You can make people doubt the way that they were going to be saved, and it could be a damage to society. And so there was an inquisition, there were inquisitions just to get people to stop talking about things
Right.
and to persecute them and then to burn them, get them out of the body politic, because, or the whole body, the society, because they were going to corrupt them just by asking the questions. So how do we get back to the point where a question in and of itself is so threatening that someone needs to be persecuted or shamed or, ignored or ridiculed, whatever it is? It's very interesting.
Yeah, and I'd love to share just a chart for a second and look
Mhm,
back at the history of Neptune at 29 Pisces, because I
mhm,
this is the Neptune part. Because there's there Neptune does deal with deception, but of course it deals with very beautiful spiritual visions, dreams, but it also does deal with the things that are hidden in the closet, like the skeletons in the closet, or brush how much dust is under the rug, really, right? Um, and at the last degree, it can become the most hardest place of the whole zodiac because it is the last degree of the 360 degrees, right? It's the last degree before it restarts over at zero Aries point. So it's the idea of the light that you have to believe that will show up. It's the minute before the dawn comes again, right? The darkest before the dawn. And I think that, you know, to have the questions like this at this moment are important because we're in it and we've been in it. And I wanted to show that the date. So May 3rd of 2024 this year, that is where Neptune, and I'll annotate this too. Neptune came into Pisces and hit that 29 degrees. It's been there since 2011 into 2012. So we saw that Neptune finally hit 29, and this is that last degree where the deception becomes beyond paramount. Like it's overwhelming. It also is the planet that deals with propaganda. It's the planet that deals with being lost in the fog, also psychological issues on a collective scale as well. But a lot of hidden things um, kind of becoming like too much for people to bear. They know there's something on the other side, but they can't see it. So it becomes kind of a cognitive dissonance, or it becomes like suppression at its greatest. I would call Neptune 29 Pisces like the Great Suppression. I know people are worried about Great Depression because of monetary means, but to me, it's more of the suppression, right? Or it kind of deals also at the same time with like, when somebody lies to you constantly, that you forget that they're lying to you, right? So if we were to look at in the past, so we'll go to the previous one, which was in 1862, but it was there for multiple years. So this is during the Civil War. So 1861, its first entry is in 1860 on August 10th, 1860, and Neptune at 29 degrees of Pisces. And so, and that's a time where, and actually that was the retrograde. So the actual time was May 23rd, 1860. It's a 165-year transit. Um, and that's at a time to where people know there's a big elephant in the room about slavery, about the past situations that had happened in Bleeding Kansas and other territories, and we've covered that. But that's also a huge propaganda in the media. We covered that too, about the Lincoln speech and Douglas, and going into that. That's also the split of the Democratic Party into two parties. Um, and thinking, and actually we didn't cover this part of the history, but there was meetings to try and bridge both those parties together with the Constitutional Party to all go under um what was his name? Oh man. Not Douglas in the South. I just had his name in my head.
Was it Breckenridge or
Breckinridge, correct, yeah.
was it?
So
Okay.
and the former vice president, and who was the Southern Democrat. And it was Stephen A. Douglas who said no, the Northern Democrat.
Hmm.
So that's where, we're already seeing divide, right, in the Democratic Party right now about candidates, right? They don't want Biden. Biden just had his talk. He had an interview that came out this last weekend saying that he was pushed out.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
the prior one is 1698. Now this is where I think we did some of this covering, but in England at that time, that's getting ready for the beginning of the 18th century, right? It's the end of this 17th century, and of course the English Civil War had already gone, but I think this was the bringing in of the monarch from Holland, right?
Mm-hmm.
The orange, right?
William of Orange, William and Mary. Yeah. They had already been in. Um, so I'm trying to think of 1698, but we talked about the buildup to that time, and it was all about, again, it was a religious motivation. It was, we need to get rid of James Stewart, who was a
Hmm.
Catholic king, who has an heir who's Catholic. As soon as he, had that heir, um, people who were against Catholics rose up and pushed him out. But I mean, he fled. And then William of Orange, who was Protestant and married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, they came over and became monarchs. But in the build up to that time, there was all this fear about what Catholics could do in society and how they were against the king, and this fear of the Pope, right? It's the similar issues as to what came up under Henry VIII's time.
Right.
So,
And also going off of bringing a monarch back after a civil war, um, and then really kind of going off the idea of like the line the way it normally is. Like, we're going to bring in these people. They're connected, but they're not, they're kind of loosely connected, and they're going to be the monarch.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it was the sell of, well, it doesn't matter anymore because we have parliament and we have a voice, right? Like that was another part of it. Like, well, they're not such a supreme monarch as much as prior,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think Isaac Newton was around for this, right? Or was he
Yeah.
go? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, and then the other idea was, of course, right, the aspect of parliament. The idea was, okay, they're going to be monarchs and they can rule if they agree to this Bill of Rights that we're going to give them. And, you agree, you're sharing power with us, right?
Uh,
And so that's how parliament got to be part of the equation with that, so.
yeah. What's really interesting is the actual date of the first part of Neptune at 29 Pisces is this March 31st, 1697. But it's very similar to what we're going through now with Neptune, an outer planet, being at its end, but also the planet Uranus, which happens to be here in Gemini, and within a year it's going into Cancer. So it's the same, like we're in the same right now. Uranus is at 27 of Taurus. It's going to retrograde here in the weeks ahead. And Neptune, of course, is in retrograde, but the beginning of 2025, we see both these planets move into a new sign and then come back to say bye bye. But that is 1697 through 1698. And so there is a similarity there. Pluto, of course, had just come into Leo, which is opposite of where it is now in Aquarius, coming back into Capricorn. So that is another, so that, believe it or not, that's a huge turning point of the world,
Hmm.
because it
And
does
that's,
it does change. And if I think of like, the Pilgrims in 1620, it's already now been 80 years and there's people now in the new world. And this is like the new world turning on and becoming more of a focus point, and kind of the end of like the major, you know, if we're using English history, like, you know, the where the monarch lives and where everybody is located, people have their eyes on the new world. And that
mhm,
term's used a lot at the turn of that century.
right. Are you showing that chart right now, or because I only see, am I, I'm only seeing one for today, I
Oh,
think.
I don't know why it's not changing over. That's so weird. Hold on.
Mercury retrograde. I had to say it.
That's so weird. Um, hmm. Why? And the Mercury retrograde has been very doing a lot of this stuff lately. Oh,
Yeah.
it's just so annoying. Hold on. This should fix it. Um, let's try one more time here. But, at least I gave the date if it wasn't shown, but that turn of the century, but that whole idea of a new world is also being talked about now, although I think a lot of people have a fear about it. But it's kind of interesting because if you take it from like an American standpoint or even a European standpoint, the idea of the new world is the world that we kind of looked at as make our shoes, make our this. And this is where the other side of the world, it moves east again. And that's what's kind of weird is watching this, like it's not all about just us, because it's so funny if you take Copernicus and the idea that we're not the center of the universe just being here, right? It's kind of the same way that the Western world thinks it is.
Hmm.
There is more on this planet than just handbags and iPhones and social media. And people live differently. And look at
Right.
India is now the number one populated country. It's beating China in population. And so you have this whole other Eastern world, and then you have Africa as well, and you have look at Russia right now too, and the China connection and North Korea and these other places all starting to come together that are forming alliances through monetary means. You're seeing things in even South America too, in those countries. Like it's not so um centrally focused anymore just about our lives in the Western world. I think that's a lot of like where maybe some fear might be, but it also might be kind of nice to not have to always be the one doing everything all the time,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, that's the thing that I guess I feel sometimes when we're doing our show and we look at these times and we're pointing out, okay, look at this is another time when these things were happening. I would hate it if people had the idea that, oh no, what are we supposed to do? It just continues, right? That's kind of the idea from the beginning of the show. Um, but I feel like it's really important to look at those times and to, I guess, also to see where we are connected to those times and to be able to anticipate the kinds of things that might happen next
Right.
so that we can continue to be who we are. Because, history is always told about the people who won and the people who had the power, primarily until recent times. There were more efforts to try to catalog and collect the histories of people who were just ordinary people. But so my question right now is again focused on the elite, but it's not, this isn't to say that I don't think people have power and we should definitely talk about that. But one of the things I'm wondering is, since you said it was Pluto in Leo at the time when the monarchy itself, if we just look at Great Britain, the monarchy is changing and it's becoming more constitutional and it's becoming more in line with this trading nation. So the Dutch were very wealthy and had colonies in parts of the world that would have been advantageous to a lot of members of parliament in England. So they had a lot to gain in bringing the king over, and obviously, and his wife. But would Pluto and Leo at that time have been the opposite of what's happening today, or how are we
Y-
connected to that?
We're connected with the outer planets all moving into new signs. Pluto first, Neptune second, Uranus third. Same thing.
Okay.
And we're dealing with Neptune in the same spot. And we've been kind of focused on this Neptune position because of the um whether it's the smoke and mirrors or the suppression, and also kind of the magic trick of look over here, but I'm doing this over here. And also the way that things are kind of washed away. The things that have happened, like if I take the English history, right? The English Civil War, like this is the thing that gets rid of the English Civil War idea that we've figured out how to, we know what makes us happy now. We want a monarch, but we kind of like that they're not that powerful and that we have our parliament and that we have these agreements. And it's kind of nice, maybe even bringing in a monarch that isn't so old school and is a little different. But I don't know what the people's sentiment were about them coming in as the monarch.
Hmm.
Is there a lot of history about how people handled that shift?
There is a lot of history about that. And I mean, this is where people who enjoy the books and the show Outlander, they know this history of the Jacobites, that there was a fear for Jacobite rebellions for quite a long time because there were people who stayed loyal to the Catholic monarch and they lived in England, and every so often they tried to raise rebellions. But beyond the political level, the thing is that there have been a lot of social historians who do the history of popular religious belief
Mm,
or popular customs, the customs of everyday life. And people's actual daily lives changed very little. So in a village somewhere, you have people carrying on with their practices and sometimes their beliefs, and the churches would continue doing like more Catholic things in some places, and they did more Protestant things in other places, just like what they'd done before.
right.
The problem would have come about when, if somebody who had different beliefs tried to then use that to go against the government. So
Mm.
there was, I don't know. I don't think there was necessarily toleration, or yeah, I guess it's the right word. But what there was just an inability to inflict control on everybody, right? So
So does that mean the way that I would read that is the parliament is the one that handles that though, right? So it's not like the monarch is the one directly dealing with maybe people coming out. The monarch, in my way of looking at parliamentary monarchs, is like you do our bidding for us now. Even though you're saying you're representing the people, you're also policing the people for us too.
well, yeah, members of parliament would be policing the people and helping the government with a lot of money, that a lot of them may have been very wealthy, and they're helping to keep the government fighting wars overseas and all
Mm.
of that and expanding. Um,
Yeah, and dealing with the Dutch for many, centuries prior, and kind of like getting their butt whipped by the Flying Dutchman. And then yeah, it does kind of this new world does do more than just what's happening with the colonies in America that form, but after this, but it's more also about Indonesia and the South Asian Pacific, and the battle with the Dutch there. Like the Dutch had the East, and the British had the West, and the Indies.
mhm.
And then it's kind of interesting that it's World War II that kind of busts all that up.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
another weird part too, is we're not seeing in today maybe that as much,
Mhm.
because that's a lot of that's been dwindled down. It's kind of interesting that France still kind of has some places, but
Mhm.
even the monarchs or the English still do. But you're not seeing the princes on their tours as much anymore, and ever since Elizabeth has passed second. Um, Under Charles, we haven't been seeing this kind of global tour to go around and check on those places,
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I
right?
mean, but the other thing I wanted to point out, so a lot of times where you will see the monarchs would be in a religious context in the
Mm,
Anglican communion of churches. So a lot of times you'll see them doing something that's related to a religious practice. And I feel like the thing to keep in mind, especially about the 1680s, is that we're talking about a nation that has an official state church, right?
right.
And that's the thing. So Parliament may have some control and the king has control, but you also have people within the religious establishment who also have control. And unlike members of parliament, the people within the church are in contact with ordinary people at least weekly, if not more, because there would have been services at all different times during the week, not just on Sundays. but most people still have to go to church. Even in the colonies, they're required to go to church. It changes, right? But somewhere like Virginia, where people might have been plantation owners and you're out on your farms, you have to at least come in to go to church once a month. And there were laws about that. So where you're getting your news and your information about how you should be thinking as an appropriate British person, it's happening within the church.
Mm,
And I feel like, that's this unquestioning authority, even though it's not Roman Catholic anymore, right? But
right.
it has its doctrine, it's got its book of common prayer. So everybody knows what the service is, they know which Bible they're supposed to be reading. And then there are even sermons that can come down from the top that people could read, and there are just church people who become very popular for the types of sermons that they write. So
Ah, that's
that's
right.
where there's
Yeah.
really, and then if you think about what's happening in Salem, even though they're not Church of England, that tradition is still there where people really expect religion to be part of their lives. And that's the thing that is different. It's people think, okay, well, we don't have that anymore. But I just always think, yeah, even though we don't have an official church in this country, and maybe England is more and more secular, uh, we can think that we still have ideas that you're expected to believe if you are a certain type of person. I mean, it seems so much like religion today, the way that beliefs, or not even just beliefs, like what were we saying earlier? Just the way that what you're supposed to say and what you know about the world, it gets communicated on social media. You're always in touch with it, and it becomes like this new doctrine that,
Right.
you can't, if you say something against it, it's misinformation. So,
Well, and that's why Isaac Newton, who was in Parliament at that time, who did not believe in the Trinity, kept it more to himself, even though some people in Parliament knew. He didn't speak about it, and he also acted as if he was, because it was his way of being on Parliament, um, because of probably those weird situations that are in Parliament dealing with the monarch and the Church of England, because like the Archbishop of the Church of England is also kind of held as a high esteemed position. That's something that you don't see in America. It's not like there's some, you know, government, appointed, and whenever there's a new monarch, they switch a lot of those people that are in positions at the Church of England out. Every new monarch brings in new people.
right.
So, like we think of the executive branch and the appointees that they have to make, right, for all the federal agencies, and what hasn't stopped, and also why the Church of England needs to be there is who's going to anoint and who's going to do that spiritual service of the anointing, right? And actually, it's interesting that it's the church that is the one giving to the people the authority for that monarch to take reign.
Hmm. Yeah, I saw in the chat someone just mentioned the monarchy is getting less and less power, I think, was the idea of the comment. And I was thinking about how it used to be that this is what's really interesting about the UK that I can't quite figure out. So I want to get back to the church thing too, is that it used to be labor was very critical of the monarchy because it kind of was a big tax suck away from the common people. And that was labor's stance. I used to think, but now it's very different. We have a really different configuration of powers.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. But the second thing is that I don't often see, and I'm not advocating for this, right? But I don't often see, and I'm curious about whether there's a criticism of the power of the Church of England, because there are appointees within the church, and there's a network of churches that are all funded by the state. And I wonder, do people question whether services are being provided? I know that there are a lot of schools that are run, or there's a lot of education that happens still within the churches, but do people ever question whether the church should have that money? Because it seem so odd? I mean, that's one of the things that students really can't believe when you point out there is still a state church in England or in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I was gonna say like the fact that when Charles had his what do you call it? I always say enunciation, but it's not that. It was
Consecration or
where
the
he gets crowned and
coronation.
all that. It's formal. I don't know why,
Mhm.
but Uranus is square my Mercury still.
I think coronation.
Coronation, right? So the coronation of the king, right? This was the first time that we had seen the Church of England and the Catholic Church come back together through the Pope offering a piece of the quote unquote true cross for the coronation. That so when I hear people say, well, it looks like the monarch's just gonna flounder out somehow. I think you bring up the best point that the Church of England's getting funded by the state, by tax money and other monies that come through old land and deals in other countries, or even the tax money that comes from Canada or from Australia too. That, um, to me, that's kind of the you need our help if it gets weird, like the old turning back to the clock of where it was in the 1280s of the getting all the countries together to form a coalition, which you're seeing with NATO right now. Kind of the other version of that being like, no, don't worry. All the countries, remember we did that list. We used AI, but it was very smart to use that list instead of us having to do all that research for days, right? Of
Mhm.
like what countries that are in NATO support uh, Catholicism, right? And which ones don't. And then it was like, oh, majority do, right? It's like, oh,
Mhm.
okay. So at the end of the day, the Catholic Church, if it wants to do something, it can sway. But I think that people, if you actually look at what's happening with the monarch, if something gets dicey there, that's where the Catholic Church calls on France, calls on the leaders of these NATO or even UN and goes, hey, listen, this is the way it's been for 1,000 years here. We're not going to allow that to change, right? You're going to step in. We're going to speak up, even though we don't agree. We've had our bad riffs in the past. We're all still believing in Christ or God, per se, right? So
Mhm.
I think that the backstop that people aren't seeing right now is what makes this harder to break away from a monarch is that they have a church installed. Like the fact that the Americans, the colonial Americans, did their Declaration of Independence was for their freedom of religion. That was one of the main acts that they did of why they did it. Of course, taxation without representation, you know, their troops quartering, all these kind of things, but also just having a monarch, right? But they were willing to separate from a Church of England without question. There wasn't some guilty feeling,
Mhm.
right? But I think if you add on top the Catholic Church, and then, you know, because that is really weird. You go, since Henry VIII, it's not like the Catholic Church and the Church of England are buddy buddies or doing things for each other for 500 years up until this year,
Mhm.
right? And they made it public display. So that's I think one of the more hidden cloaking Neptunian things that is happening right now is the way that the alliances all kind of work, right? Scratch the back of this in order to scratch the back of that. I think in America, the reason why the Civil War did not go maybe as planned as much for the South is because the South actually did it for a religious reason. They actually believed that God had ordained them in their lives to have plantations and that they gave slaves a better life, right? You and I did that in 2022, right? Like we
Mhm.
had the extra time. It was really mind-boggling for me to actually read Robert E. Lee's uh, diaries to his wife and journal. But that's also the sentiment through a lot of other people that were in the South, and part of the Confederacy was that they all had this godly spiritual thing, but there was no church with it. So I think that was where the North, right, and the Union um, did it for a cause of the Union. It wasn't for a church, right? It was for the cause of the Union. It wasn't for a spiritual belief. So, like Breckinridge, for example, he was in Congress. And so after losing, he went and reported to Congress. And then he ended up becoming a traitor because he joined up with the Confederates when Tennessee got invaded and said, I don't feel like I stand with, this Congress anymore. There was a lot of congressmen who were still in Congress who left the American, Congress to join and then became traitors. And then when the war ended, they left to France and hung out in France for 4 years because that was the only ally we had that was really strong, that they could live their life, and waited until Reconstruction happened, and then they granted immunity for anybody who was called treasonous at that time. And this is after Lincoln is shot and when Johnson comes into power, and it's Johnson who was a Democrat. I don't know if you remember, he was that when Lincoln ran in 1864, he intentionally wanted a Union Democrat that fought with the Union on the ticket to show unification, and didn't run as a Republican, but ran as the Unification Party.
Mhm.
Then the second he meets him in person, they had never met after the election went happened, is the night he gets shot. And he lives, Johnson, but everybody was supposedly going to get killed that night that were in the Lincoln's cabinet, because Lincoln gets shot. They had a drunk guy that was going to kill Johnson, but he got supposedly too drunk. And he's known as one of the worst presidents, Johnson, because he is all for the Republican cause and all that. And then after a year of being president, starts switching and going against that, and actually votes against the first Civil Rights Act that happens in the 1860s, the first Civil Rights Act. There's been like more than one.
Mhm.
And it's the first time in history that the House and the Senate get vetoed by the president and then revote to not have it be vetoed and become law, that Civil Rights Act. So to me, it's kind of like looking at that history and looking at where we're at now and looking at all these weird moments. It, it, nothing right now looks clean. And that's normal. Like it should feel like Neptune at the end, smudge all over the windows, right? Like there's obviously dirty stuff going on with what's happened with Biden and Kamala, and how does everybody really feel, right?
Mhm.
In that party, right? Like what really happened? Even Nancy Pelosi got called out by Biden in that interview and then was saying, I don't know about a letter, but I know it didn't sound like Joe Biden in that letter on Twitter, right?
Mhm.
So obviously there is something weird going on there. And then you could say in the Republican Party, there's something weird going on where, well, I mean, Trump didn't even debate and beat Nikki Haley, beat Ramaswamy, right? Beat everybody. And then everybody just aligned with him. And that party is no longer the old, Mitt Romney's or Paul Ryan's, or I would say the Bushes, right? Like, because the Reagan years are different than Bush years and so forth. So, but that kind of goes with the astrology of that time. But it's really weird too, because I do feel like this idea of this new world is happening if you just use those three outer planets all within a year and a half time, moving into new areas, new signs, and doing their back and forth, back in and out, where it becomes uh, a lot like I used to use the expression of like if you have a planet in your chart and a transit's happening to it, it's a lot like a knot because we use node and that's Latin for knot and the nodes, the lunar nodes, that it's like a massage, right? So if you're having a conjunction, it's like, oh, it's going to come on the planet, or if it's on your ascendant, you've got like a big, knot on your ascendant, or you have a knot on that planet, and it's going to rub that out in the planetary way. But, when you have all these planets moving into new signs, it's not so much a knot as much as these very long, the planets with the longest transits and more importantly, the time it takes for them to be in a sign take precedence, right? Mercury retrogrades every year, 3 times minimum. Okay. So a Mercury retrograde just adds to the bigger stuff happening. If there's not a lot of bigger stuff happening, it's just a basic Mercury retrograde, rethinking things, getting some new ideas. But when you have outer planets and they're all shifting, it's like moving complete new ideas and the way the world will feel forever. And it won't, you can't go back. And to be alive during those moments are special because most people live their lives in history and not much changes. Right? Like the same way, whether it's monarchs or the same way that, let's use technology over the last like 800 years. It's like, okay, there's still just horses and cattle and farming going on. And yeah, okay, the cannonballs got a little bit better. You know, it's the Renaissance period that definitely kind of jolts that in the other direction. But there is that moment where it then becomes kind of people kind of become more absorbed and kind of take for granted the beauty of it all. And then it kind of spreads as kind of like this, like, and I think that's where we're in now is like the Renaissance period has happened, but people have kind of gotten, they're looking for things kind of that are not really maybe they've gotten too much, right? Like, I don't know. That's what's interesting about history is that it just becomes kind of like some people just don't value it as much or don't participate in it as much and others do. But there is kind of this change of how the world works, and I would say because there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and I'm always open to all of them, and I definitely know a lot of them. But this is also where when we talk about elites, whether they're families with money, this is where those change too. Because if you look at time, you don't see the same family. Let's not say a monarch, right? But you don't see the same family for 1,000 years with money that's ruling the world,
Mhm.
right? Like the families that were in support of that president or this monarch back in the day, they're not doing it anymore. Their families are not doing it anymore,
Mhm.
right? So a lot of these systems, including because Pluto deals with money, Neptune deals with the perspective and this, where's the vision, where's the calling of this world going, and where's also the calling that's completely unconscious collectively. And then on top of that, with Uranus, it's yeah, the way that people interact, the social paradigms and the alliances and the connections that we associate with the world with, it's almost like the internet going down and then putting new, data servers and actually like having to find new IP addresses in new places and connect to the internet differently and go to a different web page to get to the web page you want, or using a new search engine for the basics for somebody and how that feels. That we're at all of those things shifting. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's just never been at this height of as much happening at the same time.
Yeah, at this height and also involving as many people around the world, you know.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Neptune and Pisces at the very end, right? And how there is just this kind of mess of confusing and distorted messages with all of
Right.
the other transits happening as well. And you mentioned how Breckenridge, right? Or is it him who he wanted at the time of the Civil War to bring people together? And there are always during that time these voices calling for unification, right? Like, come on, everybody, we're all on the same page. Or if you think about religion, um, I was thinking that, the Puritans are attacking people because they weren't their version of Christian, or they shut them out of society because they said they had a pact with the devil or whatever. So
Mm,
they're not Christian. But you would then think that they could turn around and unify with all other Christians at least. And that can't even happen, right? Where you see that today, even what's really interesting is that, okay, you've got the Church of England that's always there. And maybe that needs to stay in place because the Roman Catholic Church is everywhere and so powerful, and they have access to that. And then Putin even is reviving interest in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And we can look at it, and people have and said, oh, okay, this is great. It's Christianity emerging all over. But it's not. It's the sectional Christianity. It's we're Eastern Orthodox and we're Russian and we're this because we're, this
right.
group. And so,
And it's interesting that in Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, the only person to interview Putin through this whole period of all this crazy stuff happening in Russia and the world,
mhm,
his whole first 45 minutes was, of course, about history, but also with Ukraine, but also looking at their Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity is something
mhm,
that he was sliding in there that's different than other places.
mhm. Yeah. And so there you have the ultimate difference between all these different people. And we should be able to then, you would think there'd be messages saying, let's all come together. We're all at least Christian. And there never are. Um, and I feel like also right now you'll see, like I'll see on Instagram, some of RFK Jr.'s posts are all about wanting to be the party for he wants to be a movement for unification. And it's so unpopular, or I mean, not so unpopular because it's very popular amongst some people, but not the mainstream media doesn't want to pick up that message at all. So is there something about 29 Pisces Neptune that makes it impossible for people to actually unify? And then I wanted to say about, like, we should go back and talk about Neptune and Aries and how that doesn't necessarily mean unification either. But what do you think it is that these messages get said, but no one will take it up and go for unification?
Well, because if you were to take 1,000 chickens, or like Charlotte's Web, the movie and the book. I like the movie because I grew up watching the movie.
Mhm.
The heartbreaking part of that movie is Charlotte gonna be, you know, it's not about Charlotte and her dying in the beginning of that movie. It's about the pig, right? And so everybody's unified, and you have a spider helping. What was the name? Was it Charlotte the pig?
Oh
Forget.
no, Wilbur's the pig.
Wilbur's the pig. Wilbur, right? You have the spider helping out the pig and all the other animals and kind of leading the pack. And then it gets to the fair, ironically enough, which even the English, didn't want people to have fairs to express themselves uh, at some points. But it gets to the fair, and the whole entire story turns to no, Charlotte's going to die.
Yeah.
When it's all about Wilbur and if he's going to be the prize pig or not, right? And he becomes the prize pig to where we're not going to use him for bacon and all that because he's a prize pig. No, he got us an award, right? And it's because of the guidance of Charlotte. But that moment where Charlotte starts to come into this purview of view of the story, uh, experiencer and reader or watcher, that you weren't expecting it to be if you never watched that movie or read the book, that it's really about Charlotte. I mean, the title of the story is about her web, that there was a web holding them together with her. When that job felt like it was done, she left, she died, right? The point of that is that we're at a place to where all the moving parts of people in their lives are moving out and changing, and there is no web to bring it together. So like I admire RFK Jr. a lot for his message. The reason why it's not sticking isn't because people don't want that. Actually, people do want that. There is no web to stick to, though, in this moment. The web that does stick to it, though, in Aries is defined. And unfortunately, it's through war. And I've always asked myself as an astrologer, like, well, why is there war? Like, why is the first sign Aries? Right? It's war, unfortunately, and it's part of a human nature. And I think as humans, we have to accept that within ourselves, right? There's this, whether that comes through anger or that comes through, sometimes there's unfair treatments in life where you do have to fight for something in life. Like astrology, one thing I've learned from it the most, which is probably stupid, but I think it's beautiful, is like even Pluto doesn't destroy the sign. So that doesn't mean because Pluto's in Capricorn that there still won't be work and jobs and stuff like that in the world. There'll always be that. There'll always be hierarchies. There'll always be who's at the top, who's at the bottom. Who's striving with responsibility and who's losing because they don't want responsibility in their life. So when you get to Aries, it's about it. Neptune comes in and it clears out the fog, and it gets almost too clear on what has been the fog, that it causes reactions that become very psychological in nature, of mania or manic, all the way to um you know people feeling like, how did I fall into that trap? Because that's what always happens when you have a planet cross your ascendant, or you have a planet progress like the moon to zero Aries, is you go, why would, whether you were doing drugs for 2.5 years, some people, or you were just kind of lazy and kind of lost, or in a relationship, you were like, how did I end up in this? Like, when your progressed moon crosses to zero Aries, it's always a moment of, oh my gosh, like I'm back. This is who I am again, right? So we don't know who we are. We don't know where the web that holds unification together. Charlotte's dead. So where does Wilbur go? The animals that were coming to Wilbur with Charlotte being the guide is gone. And anybody trying to be the guide right now can't just come in and build that new expression that makes everybody feel all comfortable to come back into the circle and feel really happy.
Hmm. Wow. So then
I
we're
know
all,
I used a very old, like cheesy thing, but that I think is a really clear way in these very foggy times to understand why. Because remember, in 1860, the Constitutional Party, I think his last name was Bell, under Bell, was the unification party that was like, well, let's stay a union no matter what, and let's just deal with this in the House and the Senate the way it's supposed to be done. And let's also maybe just like calm down for a little bit, let the South have their slaves, let the North work it out, and let the voting work itself out, right? And that party did not do well,
yeah.
right? So
So at this point, Charlotte is dead or is dying, or what's happening with Charlotte right now?
Charlotte's dead
Okay. I mean,
because
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 Charlotte was using her web to so clearly communicate the things to Wilbur that would save
correct,
him, right? To write the words. And I don't remember, what did he do? He showed how smart he was, right?
correct, and it well, and also for him to be able to understand the need of how to survive
Mm-hmm.
is you have to be the prize pig. Like, I mean, the movie Babe stole a lot of that in a different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Charlotte is encouraging everybody around him, the animals around him, too, right? Like, because
Mm-hmm.
there's some other characters in that one that are like, yeah, look at, come on, Wilbur, right? So she's But the idea is that she's the place that the web that unifies them in this place. And then unfortunately, the moment that finally he can be free is the moment that she leaves. So this moment for us of finally to be free, there will be nobody there, meaning that there is no web for unification because we don't like right now it would be as an astrologer, it would be horrible for me to say, oh yeah, no, nothing's happening right now. Like everything's just going normal and there isn't deception lying everywhere, right? There's a lot of, and that's just based off if we want if to make it maybe sound more subtle and easier than it actually is more like there's a lot of fog and there's a lot of things that have been pushed under the rug for too long and put in the closet for too long. I mean, look at the debt in all countries. Look at look at the way that, you know, the censorship thing just every day gets a little bit closer to actually, you know, getting ready for excommunication maybe at some point, you know, to use the old way of looking at it, that, you know, these things are no joke. And then you have the mystery of a party that threw up a candidate without showing us the people that are the delegates of each state, showing the enthusiasm about that candidate. Because I think I showed in the last talk that we did that, you know, the DNC of 1860, you know, people boycotted it and it looked more like January 6th than it looked like, you know, the thing is, we don't know what it looked like online. We don't know if there were delegates that boycotted. We know that she got enough delegates, supposedly, that's what they say.
Mhm.
Right. But we don't actually get to see, we don't get to see who dissented. We don't get to see how many of the delegates of each state, maybe some went to other candidates and well, she crossed the line, but who else was on that? We don't know any of that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
So just, but that's, you know, or the COVID thing, like so many things have happened there. The irony too is after the UK brings out all the information, whether it's excess deaths or that, you know, the government went way too far. They actually did an investigation. And then in this last 3, 4 months, all of it comes out, even in those British medical journals, the Lancet, all this stuff about COVID. Then there's an election, a snap election to pick a new prime minister and form a new body of government in the parliament, and it switches to Labor. And now it's this immigration fiasco. So that is all forgotten about.
Mhm.
Right? In America, it's like same thing. It's about the election now. It's about Kamala Harris. It's about Tim Walz. It's about, you know, these people are weird. No, these people are weird. There was a presidential assassination attempt, and nobody wants to talk about that one anymore and what's happening there. Or the more stuff that keeps coming out that looks like, you know, I'm not going to say and nobody knows the answer to that one, but it keeps leaning towards it was definitely more maybe within our own government than anywhere else, right? So it becomes very suspicious these times because they are suspicious. And it's not till the Neptune and Aries cycle that it becomes extremely clear because the hysteria becomes the last minutes of Neptune Pisces, where in order to try to hold the lie or hide the deception, it is crazy as back then it was secession, as states forming a secession from the United States of America, right? So that hysterical moment hasn't happened yet
Mm.
to be
Yeah.
defined.
Wow. So I have to point out that I think Paula in the chat pointed out that Charlotte did have babies. I remember that part of the
Oh,
story
I remember that too. Yeah.
because it's just like, oh, finally, okay, there's hope. She has babies. But I think that's so interesting to think about the many numbers of babies that spiders have. That's
Yeah,
another great
but
image.
they don't they have their own lives as babies that they're going to go do on their own. They might not
Yeah,
want to follow in their mom's footsteps of
right.
talking to pigs about whether or not they should live or die,
Too
you know?
bad. But it's so true. But then some will. And to me, that seems like a good metaphor for Neptune in Aries. from what I know about the history of that period of time, um,
Well,
what
I
you
mean, if you
have,
think about it, it becomes where like the South ends up losing quick, right? To me, quick is that 3, 4 year war. It's not a long war. It is a war, though. It's long, but it's rather quick.
but it's
You know,
also extremely violent.
it's extremely violent. But
Hmm.
people start. I don't want to be associated if my family was part of the South,
Hmm.
right? There becomes kind of this like, you know, if you're in the North, like I'm a Copperhead Democrat, meaning I'm part of the North and I was for saving the Union, but I'm still a Democrat, but I'm not one of those people. Like people go by Copperheads for so long. Like my great 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 grandfather was a Copperhead Democrat or uncle, because
Hmm.
that was my great 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 aunt who wrote the book about it and was alive for Lincoln and his death,
Hmm.
and wrote about it in a book. But that's where we're getting towards. Like I wasn't part of the COVID thing, or I'm a whatever we come up with. Like I'm not a Kamala Democrat, or I'm not a Trump thing, whatever it might be, right? Like that comes out to keep it fair on both sides and hermetic. It's like there is going to be something where it's like, yeah, I'm not part of that. And it's usually the thing, because remember, nobody believed that Abraham Lincoln was going to win. And the same exact thing that's being said right now about Trump is exactly what they said about Lincoln coming into office, that he's going to be authoritarian, that he's going to take people's rights away, that he's going to be the worst president that ever happened, and he's going to destroy the country. Same thing.
Well, and I was thinking of Neptune and Aries back in the Reformation era, right? That after it went through Henry VIII, and he was king for a while I think while Neptune was in Aries, but it really
He was, because Neptune was in Pisces in 1533 and 1534, and then went into
okay,
Aries.
so
So
it's
Pluto was in
already.
Aquarius, and then Neptune went in Aries. The 15 that period of that 1530s, the beginning of it to the end of it is the closest that we can really get. That's why I think we have such an affinity, you and I, doing this show, to Henry VIII. Is like he is that figure,
Mhm.
right? Like he's that figure that's the closest to how things will act out in reality in this time period based off the astrology.
Mhm. And people probably don't want to think about, okay, it's Henry VIII for one era and Abraham Lincoln for another era. I
Right.
mean, but they're serving a purpose of shifting the structure of an over of the organization, being there to bring in the new, right? Whatever is going to be the new era. But in both cases, it does not happen in the way that they imagined or hoped it would, because they die before they see the conclusion. And
Right.
you know what's interesting? I want to tell people they should see the film Firebrand if anyone's
That,
interested
yeah.
in the eighth, um, because it conveys this period of time really well, even though it's got a made up ending, really.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of it that's fictional. It really shows the politics within the court and how at that point in his life, and I'm sure this is happening after the Civil War as well. You've got these factions ready to go, and these people who never gave up their beliefs, and they're just waiting to get a hold of and control whatever's next. And that's why you have, I mean, after that period of time in England, it doesn't go the way Henry VIII thought, right? Like I really want to do a show about this, and we never I never really bring it up, but you've got Edward the Sixth and then Lady Jane Grey for 9 days. Then you've got Mary, who's very, who's Catholic, and you've got a lot of struggles there. But in
Well, yeah,
France,
and that's three leaders shifting in a matter of weeks. Like,
weeks and years even, right?
yeah.
That um Edward the Sixth is
But like by Edward's death to Lady Jane Grey, to marry is fast,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And
And
then
that's
Mary is only
very much
monarch for five
associated with
years.
our times.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then the other thing that I don't know whether we've talked about is that there's a whole series of religious wars that are very bloody that break out in France. And it's during that time that people actually start new colonies in the Americas because of religious reasons. I mean, and that happens in England too, but in France, there's this whole element of it's been a bloody civil war in the country. And so if you happen to be a Protestant in France, you want to you need to find your region that where you're tolerated, or you want to go to a whole new world so you can start a new community.
Hmm.
So you've got these fractured communities that end up all over the place. And then within those communities, all kinds of crazy stuff happens because they are on the margins of the world and anything can happen, right? Like there's some crazy colonies that go out into the world and disappear or start strange new ways or
Yeah.
become new types of people. So it's a really, it's like the Wild West times. And I think even after the Civil War, there's all that eastward, or I mean, sorry, westward expansion,
Right.
right? Where this whole new part of the country emerges. And it's pretty wild out there too.
Well, even when Henry leaves the Catholic Church and the schism happens, then he's looting all the monasteries, right? Because he's broke,
Hmm.
right?
Mm, that's a good point. I
Right.
mean, thinking
So,
about the church and whether it had, because it does have a role today still, I think,
right. Like,
that
I
it
mean,
brings people
it's a
together,
great
but
Pluto coming in moment of like selling a story, right? Like, oh, well, it's because I married my brother's widow. Like, that was his wife, right? So, like, I don't want to be married to my brother's wife, my widow.
mhm.
I need
Yeah,
an
no matter
annulment.
that he had written a book of the opposite or like
Right.
that's the thing. Like Henry
But
argued the
the hidden
opposite
part is
perfectly.
I spent all my dad's money, who left me more than most monarchs ever leave a kid, right? Which was actually, he wasn't supposed to be the monarch either. That's the other part, right? It was Arthur who was supposed to be the monarch, but he died young, and his brother was betrothed to Catherine. So it's also that interesting element of his brother that he's having to live up to, like, literally the name Arthur from the original Arthurian, story through Camelot.
Hmm.
And he's got to try and be all this, and he's been given all this. And at the point to where he gets Anne Boleyn, and then it all changes, and she doesn't want to really be with him and all that stuff. And then he's starting to get gout, and it just turns into, and then the money that it's more than just because of his appetite for a woman. It's got to have, Pluto Aquarius has to have a lot more connections going on, right? So like that's the interesting part of his story is it's his love life, it's his kingdom, it's the way that the whole his own citizens and his own people are going to live under a new religion, because that's what it is. It's not an old religion, it's a new one. And then as I do this, I'm gonna change those monasteries into my own, and I'm going to loot everything from them.
Hmm.
Right. And then I'm going to start taking the money myself. I don't have to give money anymore, or my people don't have to give my money anymore to Rome. I get to keep the money myself. So it's a huge new business.
Right. And then new nobles get created with that money too. So he
Yeah.
creates a new class of people who would, be loyal to him for the land and the money.
Right. So I think in these times you have to look at where are the locations where they take in money for the state besides just traditional taxes, because there is no church in America. But that's where it gets, dare I say, healthcare is that space, right? That
Wow, very
if you
interesting.
use COVID, all the money that for anybody who was put on a vent or died that was given. Um, I hate to bring up the thing, but I think abortion should be decided by states, and I'm not against abortion. I've always been very clear on that. I believe in freedom of choice. I don't believe in long term, but I also think that it shouldn't be state funded, right? Like, and so that's another kind of monastery place that the government deals with money, are at those facilities too. All the healthcare system, the hospitals are all interlinked with Medicare, Medicaid, like, like all these programs, Social Security, and so like the idea of pushing for healthcare in America, like Canada or any of these places, is really a business for the government,
Mm.
you know. So like that's where it's, I think, really weird is people are kind of not seeing the long ball here. Like when you think about Nevada, it's the only state that you can gamble 24/7 in the zones that gaming commissions, because they have gaming commissioners, and places where you can allot Reno, Nevada, Las Vegas. There's other parts too. You can go into outer parts and be at a gas station and there's a slot machine, but
Mhm.
also drink alcohol 24/7, right? Be served it. It's the only state that does that, right? So that's what the states are about. So when they talk about the Supreme Court allowing states to choose whether they have abortion or not, it's the same thing with like, what's the age to have cigarettes in that state? Some state, like in some states it's 18, some states it's 21, right? In the old days, there were states that didn't have alcohol ages, right? It was like young, it was like 16. Then it went up and then it became kind of more normalized. Like, okay, everybody else is doing this, so I guess we'll do it too. Like
Yeah,
the process is at that place, but going for it to be federalized, which really Democrat Republican is kind of just the 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 hidden smoke of federalist and anti-federalist, even
right.
though both of them aren't playing fully their parts. Like
Yeah.
you can't associate one with the other. They both play federalists and anti-federalists about their issues. And that's the squabble of America always.
Hmm.
That's what it will always be.
Yeah.
It won't be about monarch and parliament and the church, right? Like that's going to be England's, the UK, United Kingdom, sorry, but that's where, the Scottish rebellion is the 1280s and against England and the horrible atrocities that the English were doing to the Scottish people and in the lands there. And that's why I love Braveheart. That's why I like the story of William Wallace. But that we're seeing that again with Scotland, right? Like they're not playing too easy. Of course, the Irish do the same. So when you think about this United Kingdom, there's a lot there that's like, especially like Charles has cancer. Whenever he passes, like, are they going to recognize William when he steps up? Like, especially with like, where is Kate for real? Like, not fuzzy, weird videos and pictures that are very questionable. I think that those things are the kind of things you have to look at. Or in America, you got to look at like, who's trying to create more places for the government to racketeer, would be the true name of it, racketeer money from you and offer some sort of service, might not be spiritual, right? Or religious, but it's what's weird is healthcare has become a religion itself now.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. I'm sorry that I keep having to mute because my cat, every time I'm at home doing this, he comes around and just starts meowing. So if you hear him, that's what it is,
No,
everybody.
that's fine.
It's not Aurora in the background over there. It's my cat being super loud. But I really like what you did to bring in healthcare and to compare that back to the monasteries, right? Or the dissolution of the monasteries, especially because the monasteries had like a hospital function at that time, and there was an infrastructure being provided by the church that had to be that went away and really kind of created chaos on one level. And then it had to be reimagined, and something new had to come in and fill that because it had been decimated to fill the coffers of the state, like you said. And so I think, and then when you bring in the other examples that you did, what's really interesting for us to think about, or when we think about history, I think we kind of have to get back into the mindset of the people at the time, and think right now the things that happen in our transit of Neptune through Pisces or whatever it is, they are not going to seem radically different. Um, because it's going to just seem like it can fly under the radar of most people. Because even though we think now, we think, oh, it might be something like going and killing the Scots people or having this brutal rebellion. But at the time, a lot of people justified that, just like you were saying with the Civil War. There were a lot of people who just believed, oh yeah, that's my God-given right to be to own people, right?
Well, they
That
were
they
also, yeah, and they were also trying to weed out the Scottish gene pool by having English take the bed of any Scottish marriage of the wife on the first night.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, so there are these brutal things that happen during those times that we look back and we think, well, at least nothing like that's happening now. But at that time, they also didn't really probably think it was, they obviously didn't enjoy it, and it was brutal, but it might have been sort of expected, is what I'm trying to say. It was something that was within their mindset of things that could happen,
So
you
I'm
know.
glad you used that word expected because Pisces deals with, let's call it the overreaching understanding of God or the divine creator or whatever you believe in or how you get there. You do not expect God to do miracles in your life for you,
Hmm.
right? So, like the idea of expectation spiritually is always usually connected to something really dark, like slavery, for example. It was expected by the South to allow themselves to be slaveholders, that they expected God to protect them for that because they actually believed that that was their God-given right. Literally, God, that was the way it was.
Mhm.
So, what I've seen in the history, if you just even take like the Civil War, or you go back to the end of the 1600s, it's kind of the common denominator is like, what is happening that really is not that God-given right? So if you think it was about the monarchy changing in parliament, becoming more powerful, and the monarchy kind of having this kind of thing, and people starting to go, yeah, I think we need to have it this way. Maybe people started thinking about the Civil War again, or I'm supposed to do my religion this way, right? Like, because that kind of brings back the pilgrimage ideas and from 80 years prior.
Mhm.
But in today's world, it's like, what is this idea? Like, I expect something that actually does it go with God? Meaning, take all religions, there's a common thread of like, no, like, if you kill somebody, that's not good, right? You can't expect God to come through with a miracle because you killed somebody. Like, but I prayed to God so much and God came through and made sure I didn't get the murder charge on me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it like I would tell people to kind of look through the lens of like, okay, what is like the real thing that's happening behind all the smoke and the mirrors of like what the expectation that aside right now, because unfortunately it's going to be sides, and I've said this a lot, and people I think have a hard time with it, is no, this is where it does get to. There is a side that's consciously seeing it and one that's not, but where there's an injustice that's not, it's more than humane, it's not spiritually, let's call it righteous or good. And so that whether you go, okay, there's a group about censorship, and I won't, I don't want to tie you in with this, but I'm going to say it. But like the abortion issue to me is very the hardest one, because it's like I'm just going to, as an astrologer, go, well, the idea of like, I like again, I'm an American, so I go off the way that they looked at it, is everything's free to be how it wants, right? But not everything, right? You just can't go kill people in the street,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you were to be in a car accident and there was a pregnant woman in the car and you were drunk, you're not just going to jail a little bit longer, it's exceptionally longer,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So I think the hard issue here to look at the lens is like, okay, what is this idea when it's dealing with other people's souls, right? Because some people go, it's a fetus. But if you're into astrology, you use the prenatal eclipses to understand the soul, and it follows them their whole life. So really, to me, it's kind of you can't give an exact time, because it's more like some people are, some let's call it fetus. That's more of a scientific term, but some fetuses show up, and then there's eclipses that happen immediately, or some don't for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a weird red line there that is trying to be used as like, what are you talking about? I'm allowed to do this fully without lines, without anything. And I know it's a hard combo because I'm not somebody who is on that side of saying people can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But as an astrologer, hermetically, because I'm actually going against my own view, where I'm like, if that's what people want to do, that's what people want to do.
Right.
But hermetically, as an astrologer and using Neptune and Pisces and using these transits, that the fact that it's all about that, right?
Yeah.
Or allowing the state to come in and block you as a parent to a child that you're under the care and do everything for that first 18 years, whether that's the legal understanding or whether that's even a spiritual understanding, to allow them to change their sex or to do any of these things without your consent,
Mm-hmm.
that's where it starts getting into the weeds that are not good. And that's the same weeds, but I'm not going to relate it as slavery, because I think that's horrible and what happened to African Americans who have family members who are part of that whole time period, and even all the way up into even in this even these times, but let's say especially during the civil rights movement and segregation, right? There was again, that was again some a moral, like, we can segregate you at a bathroom, or we can segregate you here because we have the God gave us the authority to do it, and that's normalized. And the only party that's ever done that is the Democratic Party, and they continue to do it again at this moment. And that's the hermetic look at it. Like, it's like, because if I were to talk to a person who spoke English who never saw the news, and I were to go to a different country and just be like, here, and play the videos, and they were an astrologer, and I'd say, tell me what side you think's doing that thing that is repeating the Civil War. And it's like, it would be very easy and clear to see same things happening again.
Yeah.
right? Um, but then, hermetically look on the other side, the Democrats don't believe in guns, right? So they don't like the Second Amendment. So they're trying to get rid of an amendment. Well, the whole irony of the Civil War was the 14th Amendment that was created in the years after. So there was an amendment created to get rid of something. It's not about taking an amendment away, right? Like there was no amendment that slavery was allowed.
Mm-hmm.
There has never been an amendment about abortion. Like the whole Roe versus Wade and going down that rabbit hole, that's not Congress has never had the guts to vote on to create an amendment for abortion federally. And they've just relied on a Supreme Court case and call that a law of the land when really, federal judges could have overturned that in different states and have at certain times and stuff. That it's not the law of the way that the Constitution works. It's more of like a legal, like, well, the highest court of the land ruled for the ability to do it, and they also gave in these cases, right? Short term, like, or emergency and right? So you have some people going too far and saying, no, we're just not going to get rid of it. We're going to get rid of it fully. And that's where it gets really entangled in the weeds here, though, because it's like there are some people going too far with it, and then there's some people going too far with it on the other side. And
Mm-hmm.
and again, that's going to be the driving force and wedge, right? Because if let's say so the weird part of like that Civil War moment was like, okay, Abraham Lincoln is wanting to, and the Republicans that had just started to come in and that were running for Senate and House are wanting to form a coalition to end slavery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this massive fear about ending something people are doing that isn't defined that they can't do it in the Constitution.
Hmm.
So the side fighting for something that's not defined in the Constitution that they are terrified of losing is the side that is not doing the morally correct thing because they're relying on a right they believe in that isn't in our Bill of Rights, isn't in those first, especially 10 Bill of Rights and those first 10 amendments, and isn't in any of the writings of the Federalist Papers or any of the things that were talked about, right? If anything, the murder of a child, no matter what it is, or even prior to birth, would have, for however long, hundreds of years, been looked at as murder, right? So, and it still is looked at as murder if you go into like look at Sharon Tate, right? Like the reason why Manson, who didn't murder anybody but who told people to go get murdered, the reason why it became such a high stake case is because Sharon Tate was pregnant.
Right. It just so
And I
I
know there's a hard combo, and I don't want to associate anybody that doesn't want to be in this, and like, but this is where I've been in my astrology world very deeply for these last like because when I come out with my prediction for the election, like I'm doing all the history and it's like I'm finding those easy things for people to understand of like the South was fighting for something that wasn't protected, right? That was immoral to say the least. We can't see though in Neptune Pisces, people who believed in slavery truly were like, I mean, if you just go watch Gone with the Wind again. The way that they make that movie seem like, no, it's all good. The slaves are so happy here. They only show the happy slaves. They don't show unhappy slaves in that movie.
right. Yeah, the slaves are helping Scarlet
They
with their
show they show the
right?
ones that are in the house slaves,
Mm-hmm.
right? They don't, and the ones that are working in the fields, they're really close to the house and they have their nice little life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Scarlett in that movie, Scarlett O'Hara, right? Her Irish, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's just like, whatever. I care more about finding love with the man that I can't have. So whatever, this whole slavery thing, oh, those boys, they're just going to the war. Ha ha ha. Well, they're fighting for our way to live in our land. Those Yankees, you know? So, like, to me, like the term Yankee is super interesting because it's about people who don't want slavery. So, MAGA now to me is the same as Yankee
Hmm.
because there's been a name associated with the group of people against the people who don't want to lose what they believe is a right. But that's where the universe is bringing it, like, God's bringing the question at the highest degree of like, is it right for you to kill a soul I'm trying to bring in here?
Mm-hmm. It's really, I mean, I just think it's a really interesting thing to consider. I remember when you said this recently, um, on some show on High Vibe, you had mentioned this, and I thought, wow, right. I've always wondered what are the issues of our day that one day people will look back and they'll say, wow, can you believe those people believed that or that they thought this was okay? Um, and because of I think we're all sort of just saturated with the arguments over abortion, and I can imagine it could be similar to the era where popular sovereignty came up right before the US Civil War, and the issue of is it okay to have slaves in the states that want them or not? And should this be nationally determined or not? Right? There's just to be back in that time and to try to get into that mindset. This is when people were arguing whether or not you should be able to have slaves in different states, not was this an immoral practice. And the people who were making the argument that it was an immoral practice were the most radical people. The abolitionists at that time,
Right.
I mean, like at the time right before the Civil War, even Lincoln is distancing himself from the abolitionists because they are just the craziest lunatics. And so
I mean, that's
that's,
what you're seeing Trump do, right? Like, I'm not going to make a federal ban on abortion,
yeah.
right? And but that's why he's like, well, I like that I've made my Supreme Court because it's the Dred Scott case, the exact position of Neptune last time of the Dred Scott case in 1857, and that is going back to the states. The federal government doesn't want to get involved. Like if that state had slavery and that was your property, that's the way it is, right? That's how they did the same thing. Oh, we're overturning the whole Dred Scott case. We're overturning Roe versus Wade because that's a state issue.
Hmm.
So people could be really mad at the Supreme Court, but that well, all they did was throw it to the state, right? That the federal government's not involved in making the choice,
Hmm.
right? So it's quite the opposite of like, oh, Trump's out here to stop abortion. It's like, well, abortion's bigger in Democrat states than of all time. I mean, you can get it for free, right? You can get it all. You can go. You can claim welfare and get it for free. So and then there's other states that are saying no, right? But I get, and then that's the argument of like the federalization of like, well, the federal government has to be looking for the best, and then of course it's a women's issue more, so it feels like women are being screwed over again, right? But it's like, okay, like that's what makes women unique, though, is like is it right or wrong? I'm not saying it is right or wrong. This is where God's asking us the big question is like, is it right or wrong for a woman to determine that? We already say that a man isn't the one that makes that choice if the woman gets pregnant, right? You have to show up with massive responsibility if you get a woman pregnant and be like, I'm going to be the guy who's going to show up If you want to go down that road, I'm with you on that. If you want to have the baby, I'm with you on that too for the rest of the life, right? Like that's the moral duty, right? This is just a question of that moral understanding at the same time when it comes to that choice,
Mhm.
right? And then again, then deciphering like, you know, when is it right? And that's what's weird is when we're dealing with science and when you're dealing with healthcare, and again, healthcare, right? Like, is the healthcare genetic test correct that that baby's gonna suffer fully? Like, you know, it's never a 100% in anything in science. So, especially with healthcare, right? It was 100% the vaccine will protect you and you won't spread it to others. You know, no, it wasn't, right? So that's where it gets weird. Like that's where I feel like it'll kind of get to where, well, if it's medically about something, but then, you know, but I feel like it's going to be the fire that burns the country is abortion.
Hmm. What do you think about also, though, the issue of migrants around the world? Because we see that in so many places where you've got um, immigrants in different locations, and it's causing, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know how to say it and whether can we talk about it. And it's causing problems, right? Where there's riots that in some places they're labeling them as, oh, it's the extremists, um it's the alt-right who are leading all these riots. And it's never just acknowledging, hey, there's people who are unhappy, but then there's also other people who are being displaced because of, civil wars or different brutal situations around the world. And I think there's an effort to make that more of an argument about the rights of people there as well. Like, is it right to have borders and to deny things to people? I mean, it's sort of another argument about
It well, yeah,
humanity.
it's a human it's a moral humanity argument on a global
Yeah.
scale,
Mm-hmm.
but we're in that phase of the global paradigm shifting so much to where um you know, was it right for Hitler to just cruise into France and then go all the way around? Right?
And that
Like,
was another Neptune and Pisces time.
no,
No.
that's Uranus Taurus where we're at the end of it
Okay.
right now. And now you have the flip, Zelensky going into Russia this last week, right?
Yeah.
So so the border question will be, well, when does a bomb or a nuclear bomb go off that was from somebody that came in illegally? That unfortunately, the more that people just keep trying to not deal with that, the universe here is about to bring something that gets your attention to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or the War of 1812 is a great example because the invasion that happened came from the north, right? And it came over the border, and that's where the British came through, and they burned down the White House, right? And it's a very weird war, but it's a war that woke up the borders of the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of Pluto and Aquarius is when you're dealing with Pluto, it's dealing with people from far away that are outside, right? It's dealing with people who you don't know the face of or whatever, because it's an Aquarius and it's Pluto. But the worst place you could be when Pluto's in Aquarius is trying to cross borders, Pluto. So other people who cross people's borders, Pluto, doesn't go well. I think where it's going to turn to astrologically is in Neptune and Aries and Pluto and Aquarius and Uranus and Gemini be more of a smart system. Like, well, where's your birth certificate? Where's your social? Where's this? Like, I don't have it. Well, then you can't get all this stuff unless maybe there's a path, but it's a long path to get there. So it's more of like a denial of like, because the country has no more money, it's in debt, then the debt we're paying on top of the debt is beyond stupid. So right? There is no more just give everything out and handouts, right? Like there won't be enough money to feed school kids anymore, right? So it's like the people who pay the taxes, again, that's taxation without representation. That's really where the migrant situation is going to get gnarly. And then of course, I don't I don't want to say I believe it will happen or it won't, but the possibility that with the wars and the weird stuff happening globally is like if there is people, which that was the big worry in 2003 and 4 and 5, right? But the last time that we had these eclipses was that terrorists were going to come into this country and blow up movie theaters, and that did not happen. So to me, it's almost kind of like that's the fear, but will that really happen? I was thinking about that this weekend, and I was like, I bet you a lot of people maybe came here saying they were going to do all these things, but once they got here, they're like, "Fuck them! I'm not going to talk to them, and I'm not dealing with the deal. I made it here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I'm gonna just try and not get attention on me, and you know, like I can finally maybe find a girl, or I can find a husband, or I can find, you know." But I think that that it's not the big crisis yet, or it might not be a crisis. I don't think it's going to become one as much as these other things we've talked about. Like, if anything, and this is where it gets a little scary, is that the only thing that's connected to it is the same thing with Neptune and Pisces of these people from another country. That what were the slaves? They were people from another country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all the Democrats are saying is like make these people legal. And then they also say, well, they're the ones who are going to do the jobs that nobody else wants to do. That's actually what they're saying. So that's exactly what the South was using the slaves for. There's jobs that the white people didn't want to do. They're saying it again out loud.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that is a majorly important aspect of all of both of these eras is to try to figure out who is the labor force and how are people who make products and do whatever it is, how are they going to continue to make money and get the products out to the people what we expect. Um, and so it's again trying to figure out who provides the labor and because after the Civil War or even before the Civil War, right? I mean, the reason if you look at Great Britain, why they start to have abolition is because yes, they believed it was wrong, but there was the industry in place then. They had the machines that could do the work.
Mm,
So, I mean, that's
right.
another aspect of it would be whatever's being innovated right now and um
Well, and it could be a bipartisan thing. Like, it's weird that maybe the Democrats are just saying the ugly part out loud. That's true, but the Republicans are cool with it, but acting their part because really they have some sort of thing they want to build, right? Like the railroads again or something like that. And I think that if people really care about this issue, because I care about it in the sense that like they're human beings, but they're being used as collateral right now, right? So whether it's the Red Cross or a lot, it's ironic that it's the Catholic churches too that are the ones that are funding the hotels that house a lot of them. That they're being used for something that's on the side burner, and I don't think it's about war stuff. One, I've said the possibility for a long time. It's based off the vaccination that they're all unvaccinated coming in from the COVID vaccine, so they're going to help the population get through the COVID crisis because it's only through unvaccinated people that you can get out of this, right? Two, this whole idea of an infrastructure bill where that money didn't really do anything, but that is the building block towards some sort of new innovative thing where those are the perfect candidates. Do you want to, and also war scenario, right? Like anybody include in the new bill about the automatic draft, it's every person. That means citizen and non-citizen. That means the term now they're using is migrants. I'll use that. I'll be proper right now. That any migrant, right, is automatically in the draft. So there, it's collateral.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you have to look at the side who made it collateral, and it all happened under Biden, right? And it all happened in the same astrology as the Democrats that were in power and that were fighting for slavery, fighting for the ability to control people, and using the propaganda and using God as the main propaganda that it was their God-given right to do it.
Hmm. But now I would say too that we've got science operating as a religion, right? That a lot
Yeah.
of things are justified just by science, which doesn't get discussed all the time like science. It's being discussed like it's doctrine, which science is never, I don't know the way I learned it. I'm not a scientist, but it was not certain, right? You have
No.
theories that have to be proven or disproven, and then they're displaced by new theories as new evidence and new understandings emerge. So it's just a really interesting time. And
No, it
every
is because
time,
that's what Isaac Newton was going through at the same transit we're in of Neptune at the end of Pisces.
yeah,
And his scientific discoveries while dealing with a parliament that is run by a monarch and a Church of England that he doesn't have the same spiritual views upon, but he's spiritual and he stays in parliament. He deals with the monetary aspect. He deals with a lot of things, but he ends up becoming so noble that he exceeds most commoners to the fact that he's buried next to monarchs with his own tomb.
right.
And that to me is like when Anthony Fauci passes away, and why I've always said he'll never get in trouble, just based off this astrology, is like they will prop the lie to as far as they can and make him, an Isaac Newton. But like that's where it's hard because it's like history is written differently now because there's so much more that could be discovered off somebody in their life and digital and all the things that they do and recordings of what they said through every part of history or with the AIDS and all that stuff that people can make a different assumption, whereas you can't make a different assumption historically. Because even in America, like you look at like Breckinridge, right, who was Department of War of the Confederate Army, but he ran for the president against Lincoln. He was the vice president in America. He was actually gone for treason. Then wasn't treason after that was, done. Like, and then came back and didn't really do much. He tried to kind of come back into politics, but they make statues of him and they praise him in different places for at least he was an American, and that's part of the Reconstruction. So part of it is all the bad deeds that have been done, there will be the biggest squabble of ever time about it. And then it will all come back to the idea of unity, which is why RFK won't win either, because it's not enough. The unity comes after it gets bloody. And it has to come with a reconstructive element.
Hmm.
So like he can't unify when there's no web of unification. And I like the guy, but I'm just going to be an astrologer and just be like, and it's nothing against him, but this is how the life he's manifested it. But the fact that his voice, he has, and that I know it's not his fault, right? But with Uranus and Taurus, right? What did you see? Hitler was loud, right? And then like people are not moved by the voice with Uranus and Taurus at all if it's not strong.
Hmm.
Even FDR in a wheelchair, his communication and his voice and his vigor in his voice is what got America through World War II and a Great Depression.
Hmm. Yeah,
So it's
I
nothing
think
against him, but
right.
it's a deeper look at his life and why there is a struggle to get it out. And I know people are gonna be like, "You're such a fucked up person." It's like, no, this is just like astrology 101, old days. Like, there's a problem with the throat. There's a problem with Taurus, right? So he's not standing strong on his values enough, right? Like, there's something of his value system always shifting. Plus, he's a Capricorn and Pluto's still in his sign. He doesn't even know what he really is yet. He might want to be a unifier, but he actually is really pissed and writes books how much he hates Anthony Fauci. He hates the COVID thing. So, does he really want unity, or does he really want Pluto revenge?
Mm.
But nobody wants to talk about that because in the spiritual community, RFK is the safe thing to say that you support, so you're friends,
Hmm.
which is what people said during the 1860 election. Oh, I'm voting for the Constitutional Party. Yeah, right. Nobody was voting for that. They voted for the Southern Democrats or they voted for the Republican ticket. Right. So RFK is the dare I say the fluffer for America.
Oh, well, he
The
represents,
temp flipper to be like, well, I support RFK to keep everything okay in a conversation or wherever, right? Because people can just easily do that. Just be like, you know what? No, I go for RFK, and that just shuts down the issues.
I don't know. I know people who get so mad if you say anything about RFK. So,
Well, only
um,
Democrats, not Republicans.
yeah, that's true. I mean, in my experience, that's what I've encountered too. So,
So that's like RFK is like Stephen A. Douglas, right? Because he's the biggest threat to Lincoln. He's a Northern Democrat. And Breckenridge, right, is the Kamala Harris now, the vice president who comes in, right, and takes over the party out of nowhere. Because Breckenridge was the vice president to Buchanan, and Buchanan could have ran, and he didn't run, just like Biden. So what ends up in the election is actually Stephen A. Douglas gets last. The Constitutional Party gets third. Breckenridge gets second. Lincoln gets first. And so, you know, Democrats hated Stephen A. Douglas just as much as they hated Lincoln, right? So you got to look at RFK as like he's the fluffer for convos, also to gauge the astrology of where we're at in this election. Is like if you're somebody who says you like RFK to a Democrat that doesn't want RFK, automatically that's like, what are you talking about? Stephen A. Douglas, he's working with Lincoln. And what do you keep hearing right now? RFK is working with Trump. They agree on vaccines. They agree on this. They agree with that. He runs in the circles with them because it's the same astrology of the same circles in the North that we're trying to keep the union together.
hmm, very interesting.
So anybody who's an RFK fan, go look up Stephen A. Douglas. He does not do well at all. And
What happens to him during, I know we talked about this, but during the Civil War?
he lost his Senate seat. He was only in the Senate for 2 years, right? He beat Abraham Lincoln. I'm talking about the 2 years after the election. So he's in that for that 2 years, and then he runs for president and doesn't run for that Senate seat, and Lincoln wins. And then Stephen A. Douglas kind of falls into the background because it becomes a huge Republican Party in the House and the Senate too.
Hmm.
And then a bunch of Northern Democrats have to support the Union, so they take on a much more middle ground approach, and they don't really go. The other thing too is after the war, Lincoln gets shot, Johnson becomes the president, and he's a Democrat. The states then are run from Reconstruction from a Democrat. So Reconstruction is from from Johnson. And Johnson allows the states in the South to take forever to get back their government on track. Right? It's not like, okay, well, you're back in the Union. Let's get fired back up. It takes months to years for Tennessee to form their government again and to get who's going to be representing in the American Congress again. And so there's votes and there's things that take forever to get done because it takes forever. But Lincoln was vocal about Reconstruction on his election campaign and after the war ended and said, let them keep their guns and let them do that. So he did that, but he went to far extremes is like, yeah, no, it's okay. So
I don't, okay, so I wanted to ask a question about Kamala and the voice issue, right? Because with her, it's almost like they're trying to keep her out of the public eye, keep her voice out of the public eye because she seems to have difficulty kind of being impromptu and um making sense. I mean, there's just been a lot of criticism of her speaking. And so the way that it's been handled is kind of keeping her out of the media and these interviews. So it's almost like there's two candidates that have that uh issue with their Taurus
yeah, I mean,
aspect.
and that's what's hard is like, you look at the Uranus Taurus transit and it's like FDR runs his third term, right, in 40, and then we go into World War II. But, he's kind of on the demise. So it's not like Biden, because even though Biden has him as the picture of the president over the fireplace in the Oval Office, right? Every president kind of chooses their favorite president, puts it over. He's not close because at least FDR was the first radio address, right? Like that was big in every home. He was the one keeping he talked to the country constantly under Uranus and Taurus. And when the war did happen, when Pearl Harbor did happen, he showed up and it was a radio address. There was cameras there, and you see every microphone in the House of Representatives when the president actually speaks to the House to form, you know, the articles for war and to approve them. And it's one of his biggest addresses, right? Biden can't do that, so that's why he's out. Kamala won't do an interview or a press conference. And Trump's out there talking on X and everywhere and podcasts, and you might not like what he's saying, just the same way that my great grandparents in their notes hated FDR, right? But they still, you know, were like, well, at least he got us through this war, because a lot of Republicans didn't like FDR because of him packing the court, saying he wouldn't do that to get elected, and he did pack the court in order to get Social Security passed and the Great New Deal passed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then Biden's doing that too. So there's a little bit of weird thing, but the voice, no matter even if he did end up in a wheelchair and started really, coming in his demise the same way that Hitler did during the Taurus Uranus transit, it's the power of voice that gets everybody from Churchill to become the prime minister, and get rid of Chamberlain, right? For Hitler to really push his whole message, because it's the beginning of the Uranus and Taurus that really gets Hitler going and into power. But it's the second part of it, which we're now in the end parts of it, where he starts doing his crazy shit. Which I think that the Hitler figure of the world at the moment actually is more the Russia situation, the way that everything's going around that, So whether that's Putin, like if you just look at how they've aligned it, it's more because he did invade a country, right?
Mhm. Well,
So
yeah, and it makes sense that it would be someone who is already in power, who already worked their way through the system, because that's the part of Hitler's career that no one ever talks about. He didn't just appear one day. He played the system for a very long
a
time.
very long time.
And that's how he ended up where he was by the time Uranus was in Taurus. He had that voice because he'd worked his way into the position. It wasn't just that he was out there spouting crazy views. I mean, he started that way, but it was a really slow process, you know.
Yeah, after World War One, when he almost died, and like an explosion happened right by his ears, and he went, almost deaf, and then he took a little vacay to like Vienna, Italy, because he loved art so much. And then he started thinking about things. And then he went back, and there was the beginning of the Nazi. He wasn't the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party was already formed. And he went into his first like meeting and saw these people talking, and then was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. So I guess I'll join this cause, and really became the young voice because of a lot of the veterans of World War One on the German side, and the embarrassing thing the Kaisers did to the country through the war, and accepting the terms of the League of Nations. And that's what causes Hitler to go crazy. And then of course he tried to push it, form an insurrection, and then gets thrown in jail and writes Mein Kampf and becomes a celebrity because he's kind of the bad guy. And I can see that's why like Democrats like try to pin Trump with that, right?
Mhm.
But it's more of the fascist social, and they keep calling him Trump a fascist too, which I think is so crazy when you have the whole corporate media and all the corporations and the unions and all that stuff forming around the Democrats. That's like
Yeah.
fascist,
And the person who really perfected the ability of the state to use the media to rise,
right?
solidify his power,
Right,
is
exactly.
Hitler,
So
right?
right, like Trump can't get what he wants from the media, right? Like Hitler used the media profoundly and changed it for himself,
Mhm.
right? And wasn't even, and he also did some crazy things like change the laws in order for there to be less parties, because when the Nazi party got close, they didn't win. That's when they decided to just like, let's just make this dude vice chancellor. It'll make the rest of the country happy. He didn't win. They got like fourth place,
Mhm.
but he had gotten them to make it down to like eight parties, because it used to be like 16 parties in those 20s and into those 30s. So like the way I see the Democrats being like, no, you can't be in our party to RFK, and no, like that's what Hitler did by like changing those kind of things, and then changing it from, right, like Trump was already president, so you can already see what he did,
Mhm.
right? A Hitler figure is somebody that you haven't seen be able to do, and is a vice
Yeah,
to
and
Fuhrer, right? It goes from vice chancellor to Fuhrer.
mhm. So he rides the wave of, there are a lot of people who wanted the changes that brought him eventually to power. And he just always, every situation, he agreed to things and then went back on it later, and whatever it was to get himself into the position that he was able to seize power.
Yeah,
And I think that's why, I mean, maybe there's nobody who's exactly like Hitler right now, but I think it's important for us to realize what what really happened, because that way, the reason I think it's important to know how did someone like that rise to power is that it can't be used then as this shorthand for, you insinuate someone's Hitler and then, oh yeah, we got to stop Hitler. I mean,
right. I mean, that's
because
like before Hitler would have been Napoleon. They're going to be Napoleon,
exactly, well, but
right?
he was inspired by Napoleon. He was trying to be
Right,
Napoleon,
right. But like,
So
yeah,
there
that
is some truth to that, but um but yeah, he studied that type of fighting, and then he implemented it, right? And then he tried to do what Napoleon tried to better Napoleon, and then that got him finally kind of got him going too far. So,
Yeah, and he was a populist, but a socialist. So it's like a nationalist socialist, a populist nationalist going for socialism. Where if you look at Trump, he's the opposite. He doesn't want socialism nor communism. As far if you just go into political science, he's
mhm,
not sitting in the left part of the where you go here on the swivel here or the pendulum.
mhm. Well, I think that is also an important word there is nationalist, that um, Hitler wants to centralize the government under
Correct.
more streamlined dictatorial control. And he's really kind of taking that word socialist so he can undermine the real socialist movement that was going on that would have been more left. So it's kind of like he's co-opting that to become, to try to appeal to that element of people, but it would be more of a right type of government, right? So he was kind of trying to sanitize that, the
You
socialist
know,
movement, and to bring it into the National Socialist movement.
but
Uh,
also by saying, I mean, once he got through all of his speeches when he was vice chancellor to chancellor is when he blamed the Jews on everything, right? So
mhm.
that's where you get, is that what Kamala comes out with at the DNC? I'm not saying
Um,
she will, but if she does, then you have a good indicator of all three planets leaving signs playing out those kind of things.
mhm,
And I'm sure there's a big surprise, like healthcare for all, or she even said in the 2020 debate against Biden and against Tulsi Gabbard that she believes that, and her lawyers have said, and remember, she was an attorney general, that she has the power as president to ban the Second Amendment and end it, which that's not true. Um,
mhm,
so you have also her voting records more socialist than Bernie Sanders up until like looking at her when she was a senator, right? She's the most liberal senator that ever has voted in our lifetimes, right? In the last 50, 60 years. So,
mhm.
that kind of goes, oh, and very odd and weird. And the way that her relationship with her husband in is kind of reminds me of Hitler with
Ava or Eva.
Eva Braun, yeah, like
Yeah.
very loose, like not that big a deal. Like you do your thing, I'll do mine.
Well, I don't know
They
whether,
don't really show a lot of affection,
yeah.
you
I
know.
mean, there's a lot of similarity between that time and ours, in that also there was a big concern about the population and the health of the population. Like, as
Yes,
you pointed out
healthcare.
before, that there was,
Tuberculosis was the main
yeah,
one, yeah.
but then also just implementing the whole Hitler Youth Organization
Right.
in order to strengthen the youth and to rally them around the nationalist German values. So anytime, if we start to see youth movements being
Well, that's the
suggested
thing
out
is
there.
she's changed her logo to that brat, which is what the young teenager women listen to.
Hmm.
And then all the women who are for her and getting their daughters involved that can't vote yet to be for her.
Hmm.
Or the motto is we're never going back, which to me is an interesting one because make America great again. It's not the best. Reagan used it, but it's a positive. So it's doing something that's positive. Never going back, right? Is not saying where it's going.
Yeah, I think, and I feel like it's erasing history, and I don't like that. You know?
Well, and it's a very Pluto Uranus. I mean, Pluto in Aquarius, which rules Uranus, is dispositing it, and it's in Taurus, and it's squaring America's moon, and this full moon is going to be when she comes out as the beginning of this whole DNC on Monday. But it's like, to me, Pluto in Aquarius is Jack in the Box. Like, she's the Jack in the Box that's popped up,
Hmm.
right? So anything, and that was Obama too at the beginning of Pluto, and it's not about who they are or anything. I'm just taking who are the candidates that pop up over Pluto transits, right? So it's like, oh, Obama was just again a senator, not nobody really knew who he was, and then boom, Jack in the
But
Box
we
moment.
know who Kamala was. We knew her
Right. So that's
as a
where it's
presidential
not in her
candidate,
favor.
and she was not selected.
Correct. That's
And then
all
we knew
gonna
her as the vice president, and she played a background role.
I'm calling her the Mercury retrograde president because the whole campaign happened on a Mercury retrograde and we haven't seen her speak yet,
Hmm.
right? And her speaking has come with questions, let's say, to be fair, about how much of it is AI of crowds to even in the stadiums. You can even just watch the videos and pause them yourself and slow them down and see the crowd's faces blunt, like blunt. It's crazy.
But
Do
even
it
that
yourself.
discussion about the crowds has
It's
taken us
exactly
away.
what they knew would get Trump to talk about it, and because he always talks about crowds.
But we have to see, what is that diverting us away from? I mean, because also I know last week I don't know if it was that same rally where she silenced the Palestinian,
I know.
pro-Palestinian protesters with that horrible, mean,
I'm speaking.
yes, and just shutting people down. But I'm sure that, I don't understand exactly what happened or whatever, but I really, that didn't sit well with me at all. And it was very
What's weird is you
heavy-handed.
don't have footage of who those people are.
Yeah. But as far as we know, the whole crowd was happy if that was the same event. I mean, everybody, they were on top of each other's laps, like, because they were so excited about it.
There's clips of her saying that 4 years ago too and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. The
She's said it before.
I'm
It's kind of one of
speaking.
her lines. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I remember it during the debate, as
Yeah,
well
exactly. So
with
it's
Mike
kind of her
Pence.
thing. But I
Hmm.
think she's the Mercury retrograde candidate because it's the any astrologer would tell you if you didn't know about the election and you were looking at this year ahead and somebody said, I want to get married or I want to get, and that was the other thing. RFK's son just got engaged yesterday or whatever.
Hmm.
And I was just like, under this astrology, that ain't gonna work. But but it was like, you would tell somebody like, no, this wouldn't be the time to get engaged, or no, don't start your business right now in this
Hmm.
period, right? So just using 101 astrology, like this is far against the 101 astrology, like already. And I think what people who love her, which I'm not mad at those people or anything. It's more just like I get that they're trying to find the hope of the beginning of the Pluto transit, which was when Obama, and what was his message? Hope, right? So it's Pluto always has that beginning and end story because it's about beginning and endings. The ending story will be the one that looked like the beginning of the story, like Charlotte's Web,
Wow. Who knew it would all be solved
right?
with
So
Charlotte's Web?
the idea too that she's connected with the person of the beginning of the story in 2008 and is also so connected that he's helping run the campaign, right? And endorsed and going to be speaking at the DNC, right? Isn't a good sign. So when people go, well, Trump, he didn't have his vice president there, or he didn't have any of that. That's kind of good, right? Because in these times are the Benedict Arnolds, and do you think George Washington would want Benedict Arnold speaking at an event with him? No.
Right.
Or, yeah, or like I don't know if you saw that Adam Kinzinger story, like the grinder with his tattoo and him and all that weird stuff. And his wife, what it turned out, whether it's true or not, is that his wife, remember, he was on the January 6th committee with Liz Cheney. His wife is was the assistant to Pence for 3 years.
Hmm.
That just came out. Or Liz Cheney, her tweets are coming back to haunt her because she said in 2020 how horrible Kamala Harris is, would be the worst thing that would ever happen to the country. Now she's kind of she's just put her whole family, the Cheneys, which her dad's still alive, and the Bushes in a horrible position. They can't go back, Kamala, and they feel like they can't go back Trump. So you have a line of presidents and a vice president, or at least one because his dad's dead. But that, and remember, Bush got in through the Supreme Court. So kind of weird. So, but he's silenced now, and so is Dick Cheney, and so is Liz Cheney because of all that. And now Adam Kinzinger, right? So these are really weird moments because that's where I think the biggest scandal is going to be the info that comes out about and it's all going to come out during the DNC. And the DNC's planned it this way with the astrology because Biden's sun is 27 degrees of Scorpio and the full moon's at 27 Leo, Aquarius with the moon and the sun in Leo, and then Uranus. That event's about the guy who's it's really about because she's also using his identification number with the Federal Elections Commission, that VC, which usually she should use her own number that she's always going to have from 2020, and she's not. That's how she got the money.
Hmm.
And that court case still has to happen. And so a lot of people have a lot of hope for this woman that's illegally doing something that it's so illegal because nobody's ever tried it before, right? Like use Biden's FEC number and then change. It says Joe Biden as the president on the FEC, but it goes AKA Kamala Harris, right? That I think people who are really connected with her, and I'm saying this from love to help you so you're prepared, are going to be really negatively affected by the things that come out that are going to blow people's minds about how she really got into that position, the way that even the letter that Biden put out on just Twitter to say that he dropped out, right? And then went days without being seen because he quote unquote had COVID, right? That is not just, um, in the flow per se.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the astrology says. And that's what Pluto Capricorn is going to reap because it goes back into the sign of the Reaper, Capricorn, where Saturn lives, right? So the Reaper showing up and it reaps karma, and it's not going to be really good karma for her. Plus, Pluto comes back to square her sun and moon in her chart. So it's going to get really ugly. And then that Tim Waltz, he's an interesting case because his Jupiter sits on her moon, but it opposes her sun. So it feels like they have relations that they are on the same page, but he has a whole different playbook that she doesn't want.
Hmm.
Right. And then there's some other weird stuff about his chart too. Like he's got like Jupiter, Gemini. She's Gemini ascendant, but she has Jupiter in the 12th, and Uranus is retrograding back to be on top of her Jupiter that's in the 12th house. Jupiter's been transiting her 12th house during this whole campaign coming out. So it's not gonna go anywhere, especially Jupiter's gonna retrograde and say, hey, through the election be in her 12th retrograde. So there is no fortune coming of some new position.
So she's a pretty late Gemini rising then, is it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, all I know is that when Jupiter finally got out of my 12th, it was a huge difference. There
Well,
are
and she also has
challenges.
her ascendant. I mean, she has Rahu or the North Node on her ascendant exact. And that's not actually a favorable alignment.
Mm.
right? It's actually the biggest ego alignment. And so Jupiter's going to come and stop there and then retrograde and pull it all away from her. Right. So,
Wow.
and usually the Jupiter retrograde that s- crosses or gets close to that position and then retrogrades back into the 12th is always, a mental breakdown, like 9 out of 10 times. So she's gonna have a mental breakdown about things, the way things are going, not be, and I think that what nobody might be looking at is why is she so behind and like not out in the public much or talking? She has Jupiter in her 12th,
Mm.
transiting and natally. So she's either got really heavy panic disorder, so she actually gets panicked and they're trying to, probably she's probably in therapy and they probably are pumping her full of something to make sure that she can get through half of it. And that's probably why they're doing, I'll call it augmenting the situation by putting in a little bit of AI to make things look more poppy than it actually is. Right. And to make it seem more dramatic than it really is.
Hmm.
Because I don't think that they need to have a controlled aspect of how she speaks and so forth, because she probably is having anxiety. I don't think that like she tries to go too far for what she wants. And that's the other thing is she's relying on just how Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton was South Node in Scorpio with Venus conjunct as a Scorpio with her North Node in Taurus. So I said in 2015 and 2016, I said Hillary's not going to win because she's using Obama, who's the president who's leaving, as the reason why she should be president because she was his Secretary of State and her husband is a prior president. When you have a South Node with Venus or South Node in the seventh, your whole life is not about using your relationships to get where you need to go. And when it gets to the big one that you are blinded by and think that you're going to get to, the fortune of the South Node in Sag for her is this illusion that everyone is going to come through and support with her. But that's not the actual truth. She's going to have to do it herself, which she's not able to really do. And the worst part is it sits in her seventh house. So it literally is where she's relying on Joe Biden because he picked her to be the president or the vice president. He had to drop out in order for her to get in. And then on top of that, she's using all these ex presidents to get what she wants, that she would have no credibility without them. So it's the same scenario as the Hillary Clinton story. It's not because they're women,
Hmm.
it's their astrology, right? So unfortunately, people aren't looking at the astrology like this. And I haven't put out a public video on YouTube about this yet because, I like to come through with my ammo and make sure that I have my facts and my astrology for you to start to go, fuck, this motherfucker's right again. But and it's really just because it's really me in a good space going, all right, let me like look at this and take my time and process this stuff and look at all the data, the history. Because what we've done is cover so much of this history that really, I hope, shows people, you know, what these turning moments look like. And the idea of the new world too never really does turn out the way that people perceive it in history either. It always does turn new. It just doesn't go exactly the way that's kind of talked about prior.
Yeah, I think it's important also. I mean, the message that I would want people to take away. And oh, first of all, let me say that I always really appreciate your look at the astrology and your willingness to be able to say things that maybe aren't the ones that everybody wants to share,
Hmm.
right? That it's not the mainstream perspective most of the time. And to me, I always appreciate that because it means you're looking at it, right? And you're willing to say things on all sides. And not everybody always will recognize that because most of the people's kind of indoctrinated response these days is to uh see it only from the perspective of what they already think is a possibility or what they expect, right? That word expectation is so important. And so I really appreciate you looking at the astrology and giving this perspective. And then looking at the history of these other times, I just want to say also that, whatever happens during this transit, as you said, it's going to be something, it's going to kind of fracture. It's not going to be what we expect. There's going to be things that pop out and are not what we imagined. But people go on, right? We can always find a place within the world that ends up. And I think the important thing to remember is that uh to try to avoid like to be pulled around by whatever narrative's being spun, because it keeps shifting so much that eventually I feel like the danger is people will lose themselves, right? And I think that's what so many people are worried about, is that
Yeah.
if what happens when the people are gone who are telling you what to think next. And so I think to be prepared for that, we have to know what we think and to know we're going to be okay no matter what happens. I mean, I think that comes up every time. We have to be prepared for there not to be a web. Charlotte's babies might not follow what she did. And, we're going to need to create new webs and to be new
Yeah.
centers and not to wait for, we don't need to wait for Charlotte to come back and spell it out on a web, what we should do.
No, and I think that you put that great. There's really nothing to be afraid of. I mean, my last thought would be if you think about Pluto crossing this Michael Luton calls it the Terminator zone. I can't steal it from him because it's his terminology, which I love, but it is the Terminator zone. If you look at history, there's never been a surprise person that comes into power. It's always the person that has been in power prior that you've seen a lot of through the whole transit that makes the big move in the world. So, meaning Henry VIII was around for Pluto and Capricorn. He was around for Pluto and Aquarius. And the only way that Trump could have done that is if he wouldn't have been the president for the last 4 years.
Hmm. Wow.
And he must have, I believe that it was rigged, but he chose not to take it or fight it fully because of the curse of Jupiter Saturn.
Hmm.
Like
See.
Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan left enough, his Ronald Reagan's son knows Trump and knows this Joan Quigley astrology. He's taken his old slogan. He's
Hmm.
even taken peace through strength. That was Reagan who said that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to remind people that like this is very easy to see. And the world financial markets don't want you to see because Pluto is also mainly about banks and financial institutions, and in Capricorn it deals with the government. So it's like what those people and the governments and the banks don't want to see is we need somebody who's gonna be the guy people can hate and love when we cut social service stuff because we're gonna have to. When we're gonna have to be more physically responsible. They're not gonna push socialist. There's no money for it, right? So already you can see like they kind of want people to have the hope that that can keep going to kind of keep running it till they get found out fully.
Right.
And that's why the day that she was supposed to announce her vice president pick is when the market tanked.
Hmm.
That's always a signal. So, yeah, so like that's the stuff like doing astrology or predictive work or prophecy work or whatever is many factors. That's what I teach in Hypergate. It's like using mundane astrology, using their chart, using evolutionary history. It's very clear. And especially this moment with Neptune that's been in 29 degrees Pisces for so long, right? It started on May 3rd. So from May, all of May, June, July, now we're into August. This is the longest you can be in the Neptunian fog of the most fog.
Hmm.
So we're whoever's getting hysterical over a future prospect, it's kind of like seeing an oasis that it doesn't exist in a desert or an
Hmm.
AI campaign, which to end, that's why when they said Hunter Biden didn't have his laptop or that and all this, all the security, all the three-letter agencies said there's no way, or that Burisma, because it's about Burisma, ironically, you've been hearing that prior to 2020, right? Like this is something that Republicans were bringing up at the end of the Obama years was the Burisma with Hillary Clinton and with Hunter Biden, and it's been official today that the documents have come out that Hunter Biden was trying to coerce U.S. officials in order to get a deal while he was on the board of Burisma, right? So they lied to you and said that there was no evidence of that. But now they are saying it after Joe Biden just stepped down, supposedly, right? So, but to me, that looks like a coup where, you know what? Now we're going to make sure you don't have the ability to come back. Nobody's putting that two and two together yet. Like so right before the DNC, right as we're coming into the weekend before it, you finally let out the dirt that your son worked with you to screw over the US government and take money and get money sent to all these foreign countries and take it. You finally let that happen,
Very interesting.
right? Like how else are they going to try and push Kamala to get through this DNC craziness is separating themselves from Joe Biden that he's actually a criminal.
That'll be interesting
That's
to
going to
see
be
how
the
that,
stuff that people are not ready for yet.
yeah.
And that's how you know you're going to be on the wrong side when you're like, oh, but I'm still going to vote for this person.
Well, I mean, the more it becomes about just winning, one side wanting to just win no matter what. I really, uh, I've never enjoyed political campaigning times. That's never been my thing. I never wanted to study even US history or presidential elections, but I I miss that I still can remember elections where people actually argued about policies and actually presented, here's what I'm going to do. And it wasn't just, we have to win. We have to win. That's all that it was. That's all that matters. Why, I really wish we could just talk about policies. Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, I would even take a good argument about abortion on each side. Like, come on, let's just like argue in public. Let's
Well,
talk
when they
about
do that in
things.
the Senate recently, because the Democrats are in control in the Senate, they stopped Senator Kennedy when he got the doctor to be like, so when the fetus, that's what you want me to call it, not the baby. I guess I can't say baby, but it's at 21 weeks. When you go in there and you start pulling the arms and pulling the heart out, can the fetus feel it? Yes. Oh, that's too much. You can't talk anymore about it,
Hmm,
right? Because they don't tell that to women, right?
right.
So, like, it's actually being shut down in the Senate. The TV is only letting C-SPAN show it and not taking that crazy moment and putting it out there,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I even miss like C-SPAN on regular TV. You could sit at any time and watch what's happening, the
Yeah.
hearings. And if people don't know how to follow it on YouTube or whatever, people don't see all the hearings
No,
anymore,
they're all
really.
listed. If you go to the uscongress.gov and then go to the House and go look at it, or the Senate and look at their hearings that they have, and you can even know what part of what building they're in. And if you know somebody, you can get tickets, or if you're lucky enough when they sell tickets to be a guest to go through, you can do that.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I think that any world change always comes with what looks like it's gonna be. I think especially with Neptune here at Pisces, it's always what looks like the propaganda looks like it's going the way it is. But especially with this Mercury retrograde in Virgo coming into Leo and Venus opposite Saturn right now and all this stuff, it's like to put weight right now on the area you think is going better is just not true. So it's like, betting that the Titanic's gonna make it back when you already know it got hit by an iceberg, but trusting that it's the unsinkable ship.
Well, they
But
said it was.
but
Science
yeah,
said it.
yeah, and but that's like a very Neptunian moment right now in the collective, and that was also a propagation by the builders of that boat and the companies that were making money on it in England to get it to America to be a right that it was the unsinkable ship, and it was so propagated so big that of course it would fall,
Hmm.
like the same way
Yeah.
they did with Hillary Clinton.
Hmm. And that's a good example because people had so much faith that it was an unsinkable ship, more people died, right?
Yeah, or if you take, for example, like she's a Libra, Kamala Harris, so Jupiter and Saturn are in square this year. And so the first one starts at the end of this weekend and with a DNC. And as a Libra, that's in her ninth Jupiter, but Saturn's in her sixth. So if she's trying to keep advancing in the same routine career without making a different pivot, meaning like, I'm sure there's another thing in her life she wants to do, but her north node on the ascendant, it will only focus on that. But it has to be something that she does on her own, not with the help of some relationship, the
Hmm.
south node on her descendant. That there is that like that's what's whatever Jupiter's gains have been, Saturn in the sixth is gonna go get back to reality with it. Right. So and that can be everything from all the money that was in the till from Biden having to be the law says that it has to be refunded back to people who donate. Like and then fighting it all the way through or something. I don't know. Like there's definitely going to be some sort of very hard grind, something that comes out. And, I think a lot of people look at this DNC like the worst time. And I'm like, no, it's still Pluto and Aquarius. So people are going to buy it and think it's the most magical thing. But what happens in the world and what happens in the actuality of reality outside of that by September 1st and those eclipses that start will take away all the gains and retract more because Saturn's in a more prominent position with Neptune being in Pisces, so it's the ruler, and Jupiter's in detriment in Gemini, that it's not going to give her the gains at all. It's going to take the gains away and then take back prior to even what gains could have been had. And that's just astrology. And it was Jupiter square Saturn when Hillary ran against Trump. So it was Jupiter square, it was Saturn square Neptune as well. And now we have Saturn, Neptune in the same sign, and it was in the same area, the South Node, Neptune conjunction, while Saturn and Sag was squaring it. So, and that's when I did Age of Deception. So, and it was a Mercury retrograde in Virgo, which we started all this in. So it's replaying where in September of 2016, all of the gains of Hillary were lost by Comey coming out, right? All that stuff's about to replay.
Wow.
So Anything else that you think? You and I can
I think
go 24 hours, 7 days a week on this
I
stuff, like in the world and what's happening in history. And
yeah, I know, and I can like just stay here and be a willing accomplice and go on and on with you. But I know we always need to stop. So at some point, the questioning and my curiosity has to be shut off and we have to end the show. So,
right.
but that was amazing. That's the first time I heard you put some of that together. So I'm,
I kind of did recently. I don't even know when, because you know me, most people on YouTube don't know I do videos every day. So I don't remember the video. I just recently was kind of bringing it up, but I think I was talking more about it like for the collective, not even the politics or whatever, but the history, but like, that we're in the 20, oh, I did on Deep Astrology. We were in the 2016 like
mhm.
waters. And then we're in the transit of Venus waters right now with this Mars Jupiter conjunction being exactly where the transit of Venus with the Sun and Venus was in 2004 and 2012. Square Saturn. So it'd be interesting to look up what Kamala Harris was doing in 2004 and 2012. The shift in her career that
Uh-huh.
won't shift that way.
Yeah, I was trying to remember
So,
when did she get
but
elected?
if anybody really wants to go on these, because all I'm seeing are these YouTube videos of people during a Mercury retrograde putting out their official statement of what's going to happen. And I'm like, oh man, they're just using the natal chart and like using like, well, Jupiter's going to be in Gemini and she's a Gemini rising, and it's like, oh my God, the whole astrology community that just uses Jupiter is just really sad.
Well, that was even the thing I looked at was I thought, huh, well, Jupiter's the ruler of her south node. So is that a good thing for her if I mean, I guess if Jupiter is in the 12th house, it could be working out some karmic issues for her, right?
Yeah, and she has natal Jupiter in the 12th. And as a Gemini rising, it's about relationships, Jupiter for her. But with the North Node on her ascendant, a relationship can't deliver her the White House, meaning Biden, Obama, which is how she's got here. She didn't do it on her own.
Hmm.
So if she just would have said no to Biden and ran in 2024, and Biden would have fell down and been talking Gemini rising, Libra, and being putting up her case to the American people like Nikki Haley tried against Trump, she would have been the Nikki Haley that would have actually won.
Wow.
So, but that's how you look at evolutionary astrology and South Node, North Node stuff, like right there. That's you put a good point using the dispositor over South Node,
Well, I learned to look at those things from you.
right?
So,
Or like when Trump was elected, because he's the same nodes, North Node and Gemini and so forth. Jupiter was in Virgo, and Saturn was in square in Sag, right? So Saturn was with the South Node, and Jupiter was in Virgo, and that's fourth house as a Gemini, and that was just like his first house into his second house as a Leo ascendant. It really wasn't like that got it to him. Also, Neptune was with South Node in his 10th, right? That you could say, oh, it was his Hellenistic astrology and his lot of fortune or his lot of spirit, sorry, loosening of the bond moment. And there's definitely a lot I would say that you could attribute that to. But I would say that a lot more of it is the understanding of the beginning of the story of 2008 with Obama. The and where was the role of him in being the birth denier, the one that got the message that a lot of Americans were questioning about Obama out. And it's weird too, because like he was really good friends with Joan Rivers, and Joan Rivers is the one who delivered the message about Michelle and then was di died 2 weeks later, right? Like, and Trump also was the biggest television show coming into Pluto, right? Moving. And then 2012, Trump was there for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was not there back for Trump. So you look at that kind of stuff too in the astrology, and then the transits and knowing, oh, this is the last Venus transit. And let's not forget, like he is a Gemini with the North Node Gemini with Uranus in the 10th. So he's out having to be in public talking and saying crazy shit. That's actually what he's supposed to be doing. She's not out talking.
Mm-hmm.
So, and she's basing things off beliefs, not specifics. So
Mm-hmm. Wow. Interesting campaign. This is a really interesting, different election.
it's different because
Um,
it's the 2021 was all planned, meaning you could say it was stolen, but really it was allowed to be stolen by Trump himself.
hmm,
Think of that.
yeah.
Like he wanted it to be stolen.
And if that's the case, it's probably just working out something that's in
It's
the
working out
astrology.
something bigger.
Hmm.
So, because this actually aligns with the 2016 election. So, it's pretty clear when you look at that and you look at the astrology and then you look at their astrologies and you look at what's happening that any of these astrologers out there, I can't believe they're not even thinking about 2016 and the transits or the Jupiter Saturn or the Saturn Neptune in the South Node. And we're going to have a lunar eclipse in Pisces here with Neptune in about a month after this full moon. So,
Mhm. And I don't know why people aren't discussing all of those things because this is such an interesting time astrologically that if you are just interested in transits and wanting to learn more, why be connected to an outcome? Just look at it and discuss it because it seems to me, even as you talk through all of these things, there's so many moving parts. And I know that's what you look for. You look for the moving parts that where they line up. And then that gives you a pretty clear idea of
yeah,
what's going to happen. But I guess if I were, out there in the astrology community learning something, wanting to learn about it, um, you could easily talk about it from any angle and say, well, there's so many moving parts, we don't know for sure what's going to happen, but have fun discussing all of the details
yeah,
without
that's
it
true.
having to have a predetermined conclusion or end of the story that everybody wants to believe is true. Because I mean, in my experience, every time you want to believe something's true, I always feel like that jinxes things. That's my
Right.
superstition, right? Like, oh, everything's going to be
Right.
great. It's going to be like this. Um, and if you want that to happen, you have to continue to step up control of all elements to be able to get there because I always feel like the universe does its best to throw a wrench in your plans.
Right.
What my experience tells me, but it could
Well,
be my
and
human design.
yeah, and like I think that's important because I would say that the moving parts are showing that the whole stability of even what the ticket of the DNC is, it'd be stupid to say what it's going to be when you haven't actually even seen a DNC yet, and that the stability of her being on the ticket or even her vice president being on the ticket is still in question,
Right.
right? Or even like that, like on the last show we did about Pluto Libras, like right now it's just JD Vance who has Pluto Libra, which actually makes more sense because they're very rare, right? So, and he has the same one that Henry VIII had, 29 Libra. So, And the more I keep like seeing how it's been more about JD Vance than Trump lately, right? That's an interesting way to look at things, right? And I've said like that Pete Buttigieg should pop up, right? Well, it looks like they're too afraid to run him because that would have actually been stronger for the long term, not this little bump of Mercury retrograde hysteria. Because that's all
Mhm.
Tim Waltz really is a quick hit of hysterical, um, making you believe the Oasis is real. Like, yeah, it's so real. So plus he has Jupiter at 28 degrees Aries, so Pluto is coming to square his Jupiter. So I can look at all that stuff, and it's all in my head, but yeah, he's in a weird space. So
Well, weird is the word these days, right?
yeah, and
Everybody's
Pluto in
accusing each other of
Aquarius,
being weird.
because Pluto's stationed in Capricorn, but then it's stationed retrograde in Aquarius. When it ingresses into Capricorn, it's still going to be playing the Aquarius like flipped fun. When it goes direct in October, it'll be the Saturn, and it's Saturn, Neptune, Pisces, and that's where, you know, the people who are hysterical, because you don't see people being hysterical that the media says that Harris is winning. You don't see the right going hysterical, right? But the hysteria is going to get crazy during this lunar eclipse. And then when Pluto comes back into Capricorn, it flips. You're going to see hysteria start. So,
You think on both sides?
no, on the left.
Okay.
So, unfortunately, yeah, history is repeating. So,
Hmm.
because the hysteria
Interesting.
started too around same time period in 1860 with having two tickets and them not agreeing through Stephen A. Douglas. Believe it or not, you would think it would have been the opposite, but no, with Stephen A. Douglas, he was like, no, I'm going to be the Democratic nominee. It's like, I'm running as a Northern Democrat. So, um, yeah.
Hmm.
So that's all she wrote, but I got to go. But, I appreciate you, Ann, so much doing this show with you. And I know a lot of other people out there appreciate it. And it's always a blessing to do it with you and be able to go through all these stuff because,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love doing this. I love just experiencing, hearing these things firsthand as you're putting things together. And, you know, just getting a different view of the history.
right.
Gosh, my cat has decided I'm done.
Yep.
So
That's the
kind of,
sign.
that's
Cats with
enough.
the sign. They always come in and go poop.
Yep.
So,
Oh, I guess I'm on my laptop now. So anyway,
yeah. And just thanks to everybody who support us on High Vibe, or we do this show public to get people on High Vibe and get this word out, and appreciate all the people that are watching. We have a lot of people on YouTube, but this is our first time ever doing, and I've never streamed to, there's more people watching on X right now than my YouTube.
oh wow. I haven't
And
had that open. So
yeah, there's
hello, X
421
people.
people watching on X right now.
Oh, great.
There's 401 on YouTube, and there's a couple hundred so on High Vibe. So
All
just
right.
appreciate all
Well,
that.
yeah, it's wonderful for everyone to joined in. And I mean, I really love to see people's comments that are intellectual and engaged. Hopefully not just, crazy comments. But
Right.
I really I appreciate you for being here to start to get these conversations going because I think it's really important for us to be able to talk about this and to have some sort of agency in the midst of this whole thing so we don't feel like we're just being pulled one way and the other. So thank
I
you.
agree. No, and that's what's crazy with High Vibe changing its course majorly right now. And my progressed moon just went into Sag yesterday.
Mm.
So I just got out of my progressed moon in Scorpio. Like I feel like, okay, the Leo King's coming back, people. Just chill out.
The
Like
Leo King never
it's
went
been a
anywhere.
heavy 2.5 years while I've been doing the beautiful things in my personal life.
Hmm.
So
Yes. And speaking of, happy birthday to Aurora.
I know, yeah, I know. One more day on the 16th.
Yay.
So technically though, her soul returns tomorrow. So
Oh, wow. How exciting.
it's very exciting.
I
So
can't believe it's been a year.
I know. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I remember a year ago, like going, okay, is she gonna come out? I'm like, don't come out yet. No, don't have a dark moon. No balsamic moon. She came out new moon. So, well, much love to you, Ann. We'll see you all on High Vibe, and thanks so much.
All right.
Adios.
Thank you.